What if the world before the flood still lives in our bones? What if the rhythm of the ancient world still hums faintly in the marrow of our being? An echo of a time when heaven and earth were not yet divided, when mysteries walked among men beneath the silver glow of the stars. Imagine the earth as it once was, untouched, unburdened, and glimmering under a canopy of light that needed no moon to guide it. Rivers ran like glass, carrying whispers of creation through valleys of gold and gardens of unending bloom. The air held a song, not of machines or cities, but of the living breath of the world itself. Humanity was young then, still learning the meaning of life's first dawn, still walking close to the voice that had formed them from dust and dream. They spoke not of progress or conquest, but of wonder. Each sunrise was a revelation, each night a quiet hymn. There was no greed, no war, no hunger. The earth was pure, and the stars above watched with an affection that only angels could understand. But the boundary between heaven and earth was delicate. Beyond the soft veil of the sky, countless eyes gazed down upon creation, beings radiant and ancient, watchers of time and order. They had seen the forming of the mountains, the cooling of the seas, the rise of man from clay to consciousness, and among them stirred curiosity, a yearning to know what it meant to be mortal, to feel the pulse of flesh, to love as humans loved. It began not with rebellion, but fascination. From the high courts of heaven, where harmony reigned eternal, a few of the divine looked downward, not with contempt, but longing. The music of earth had reached them, and its melody was unlike anything in the celestial realms. It was imperfect, yet alive, fragile, yet beautiful. They watched humankind with eyes filled with both wonder and danger. For what begins as admiration can easily become desire. Before the first storm ever broke the sky, before the first drop of rain ever touched the soil, there was stillness, a silence that trembled between worlds. The earth lay under stars brighter than any we know, and the night was gentle enough to make even angels pause. Among the people, legends began to form, stories whispered beside fires, of shapes seen in the clouds, of voices that spoke in dreams. Shepherds who wandered too far from their flocks claimed to have seen tall figures upon the hills, cloaked in light, whose eyes carried the weight of eternity. Farmers swore that their fields glowed after these visitors passed, and that their hearts knew both awe and fear in their presence. They called them the Watchers, though their true name was lost in the winds of time. They were guardians once, keepers of divine secrets, sent not to interfere, but to observe. Yet the line between watching and yearning blurred. As ages passed, something ancient and forbidden began to stir between heaven and earth, and in this delicate moment when humanity still lived in innocence, the first seeds of corruption quietly fell, but not all was dark yet. Life still flourished in peace. Children played near the rivers that shimmered like molten light. The wind carried laughter through fields of emerald grain. The moon, soft and full, sailed across the heavens, unknowing of what was to come. Even the stars seemed to hold their breath, as if sensing the coming fracture, the moment when the sacred harmony would be touched by desire. Those ancient nights carried a fragrance that has long vanished, a blend of cedar, rain, and something divine. The people looked upward and believed the stars were eyes watching over them with love. They could not have imagined that those same eyes would one day descend, driven by a hunger that heaven itself forbade. And yet, the story of that descent is not just the tale of angels and humans, it is the story of longing itself. of the heart's pull toward what it cannot have, of divine beings tempted not by power, but by love, the most fragile and dangerous force in all creation. When the first angel looked upon the daughters of men, the world shifted ever so slightly. A tremor passed through the fabric of existence, faint but fateful. The harmony of creation bent under the weight of a new emotion, one that heaven had never known in such a form. The stars continued to shine. The rivers still sang. But somewhere, in the space between heaven's purity and earth's innocence, a shadow began to grow unseen. But, inevitable, the ancient world still sleeps beneath our feet, buried under oceans and continents, remembered only in fragments, myths, and dreams. And perhaps, in our quietest moments, when we gaze at the stars and feel a longing we cannot name, we are hearing the faint echo of that forgotten age, the whisper before the flood. Subscribe for more ancient sleep stories, and write your name, your city, and the time you're watching this in the comments below. Let the night remember you. The night skies over the ancient world shone with a beauty that has been lost for a long time. It looked like every star was alive, speaking a language that was older than time. People of light watched the earth from the high places of heaven with quiet awe. They had been given the job of protecting its rhythm and keeping the balance between the worlds. They were only supposed to watch, not get involved. But something moved in their immortal hearts, something that neither heaven nor earth could hold, under the silver glow of the firmament. It started with a look. The sons of heaven, bright and clean, looked down at the daughters of earth, and in that moment, everything changed. The daughters of men were unlike anything the gods had ever seen. Their laughter was warm, and their eyes held feelings that were hard to understand. They moved with grace that was unplanned, not perfect, but full of life. The angels had seen stars form and worlds burn into being, but they had never seen the raw, unguarded beauty of love between people. Interest turned into admiration. Admiration turned into longing. And if you don't take care of your yearning, it will turn into defiance. Genesis says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair, and they took them as wives of all whom they chose. They didn't do it because they were told to, but because they wanted to. Their rebellion was not based on hate, but on love. One of them, who was as tall as dawn and as bright as lightning, was the first to talk about it. He stood at the door to heaven and told his friends in a low voice that he would no longer watch over the lives of others from afar. He didn't shake with fear. He shook with conviction. Why should we only look from a distance? He asked. Love itself calls us down. Yes, said the others, one by one. That night, the stars seemed to dim as heaven listened to their promise, which would last forever. Their fall was not one of fire or rage, but of grace. They didn't come as conquerors. They came as travelers. People around the world were amazed by them. People thought of them as living dawns beings of impossible light, who spoke with voices that were both loud and comforting. When they saw the women of earth, their hearts softened, and their eternal nature bent under the weight of mortal emotion. For a while, their relationship looked great. Villages thrived, songs filled the valleys, and love stories were told in the dark. The women who caught their eye felt special, and their spirits rose above the everyday world. The sons of heaven, who had once been untouchable and cold in their high position, learned what it meant to love and to hurt. They taught the people what they knew about stars, the earth, metalworking, and healing herbs. Where there used to be silence, knowledge flowed like rivers. People became smarter, stronger, and braver. But every gift has a dark side. What had started out as awe started to change as it looked back. The Watchers, as they were called, were stuck between two worlds, the light they had left behind and the darkness that was growing in the hearts of men. Pride and love both opened the gates. The daughters of men, who used to live simple lives, started to want the powers that their heavenly husbands had. The sons of God saw how much they wanted something and tried to make them happy. In doing so, they told secrets that heaven had promised to keep secret. The nights got heavier. The air, which had been full of laughter, became restless. Men began to want power and to shape the earth, not in harmony, but in hunger. The angels, who had once been full of divine purpose, now walked the world as strangers to both heaven and people. Their love had turned into a curse that they couldn't get rid of or forget. Still, some moments were still sweet, even though they had made a hard choice. A watcher might sit next to his loved one under the stars that were fading, tracing the lines of her face as if he wanted to remember every shadow. He would sing songs that were both sad and loving, words that no one else could understand. And she, who was mortal but brave, would listen. She didn't fully understand, but she felt every word in the quiet ache of her heart. Their love was forbidden and weak, but it burned brighter because it was doomed. Heaven and earth met in their kids. The blood of angels mixed with the clay of man, and from this mix came beings that were very big and strong. People saw them as heroes, giants, and protectors, but as time went on, their hearts became wild and unbalanced, fueled by the fire of their divine lineage and the weakness of their human one. The ground shook when they walked. What had once been a blessing started to eat itself. The Watchers still watched, but now they were not guardians. They were fathers of a world that was fading away. They had loved too much, given too much, and broken the law that kept heaven together. But even as storms were coming, their hearts stayed with the people they had chosen. Some people prayed for forgiveness, while others prayed to be forgotten. But none of them could come back. The gate they had gone through was now closed to them. But their story lives on. In every story of love that doesn't make sense, and in every heart that chooses feeling over fear, the echo of their choice lives on. Love, with all its beauty and sadness, still has the same risk, giving up heaven for the touch of earth, or giving up eternity for a single heartbeat. The sons of heaven saw the daughters of earth and chose to fall. And when they fell, the world learned that even angels can't escape the oldest mystery of all, love. The air on Mount Hermon was still, but the wind whispered secrets through the rocks and pines. It was so cold that it seemed to touch both the earth and the sky. The sons of heaven came together there in the grey light of dawn. The first silver rays of morning light cast half shadows and half light on their bodies. At first, there was no need for words. The silence was enough to show how heavy things were going to be. Every look and every change in stance showed a tension that had been there for a long time, like a mountain and a desire that had been building for a long time. They didn't come as conquerors or intruders. They came as seekers of something forbidden, a way to connect their eternal world with the fleeting beauty of humanity. Shemyezer, tall and glowing, stood in the middle. His eyes showed both wonder and doubt. He had been one of the most loyal of them all, a watcher who had seen the earth go through many cycles but had never been affected by human desire. But now he could feel the pull in a way that he couldn't deny. To come down, to mix with people, to touch their lives and love, he heard it in a way that even heaven couldn't stop. He was still unsure though. The oath they were about to take was a promise that would have effects worse than the mountains themselves. Azazel, on the other hand, moved with such confidence that it seemed to pull the winds of the mountain toward him. He welcomed the cold, letting it bite his skin as if it made him stronger. Azazel leaned forward and spoke in a low voice that was carried by the wind. He talked about freedom and the chance to live with people who felt so strongly that their hearts beat in a way that was completely different from theirs. "Will we stay here forever, just watching?" he asked, but the question was just as much for himself as it was for his brothers. "Or do we go beyond what is given and feel the pulse of life like mortals do?" His bravery wasn't arrogance. It was a desire that was both pure and dangerous. The watchers started to make a circle, and the ground below them was quiet and cold. They all put a hand on a rock, an old stone that had held up for many years, and together they made a promise that would tie them to each other and their chosen path. The words were simple, but they had a weight that the mountains seemed to echo. "We will go down together. We will stay together. We will not turn back." The oath echoed across the cliffs like thunder, not in anger, but as a sign of unity. A promise made in front of heaven and earth. Every watcher could feel the tremor of choice under their wings. They were both excited and scared to step into a life they had been told never to know. The jagged edges of the mountains cast long shadows that flickered like ghostly witnesses, making the mountains themselves look like they were leaning in. There was no anger in their meeting, no shout of rebellion. They all knew that the path ahead would change not only their lives, but also the world below. Even as the oath echoed through the cold peaks, Shemyeza's hesitation stayed. He looked down at the forests, rivers, and villages that lay below the mountaintop and thought about how they would change people's lives. Could they stay alert without being tempted? Could they come down without breaking the order of creation? But as he saw Azazel standing tall and sure of himself, with the fire of conviction in his golden eyes, Shemyeza felt something change in himself. To stand aside now would be to deny the very essence of the heart, and maybe even the lessons that heaven itself had not taught them. The wind blowing through the peaks made a kind of chorus that carried their vows across the valleys. Every time they did it, they got stronger. It had a rhythm like the beat of a secret promise or a heartbeat shared by beings who had never really known death. In that rhythm, the watchers felt something they had never felt before, a sense of family, the deep bond of making a choice together, a bond that would last beyond fear, beyond consequences, and beyond time after that. The sons of heaven looked at each other in silence, seeing the same desire reflected in every face. This wasn't just defiance. It was the quiet rebellion of hearts that wanted to belong somewhere other than their perfect world. Their desire was to touch, love, and learn from the fleeting, fragile beauty of human life. There was both grace and danger in that desire, a mix that made the air seem full of excitement. Azazel broke the silence again, this time with a low, steady voice, as if he were talking to the mountain itself. "We walk together into the unknown, and even though we leave the light of our realm behind, we will not falter, because the bond we form here is stronger than the fear of what is forbidden." The others nodded, a small movement that made the circle look like waves on a dark lake. Their oath, which was now sealed, shone with a weight that neither heaven nor earth could break. The dawn began to touch the horizon, spilling silver over the peaks and showing the world below in all its vastness. The forests, rivers, and valleys seemed to go on forever, as if they were inviting them to come closer and weave their lives into the fabric of the mortal world. Each watcher took a moment to feel the ground beneath their feet, the wind on their faces, and the quiet of the mountains around them. It was the start of a journey that they could not turn back from, a path marked by unity, bravery, and a desire for something they could not yet name. Under the solemn beauty of Mount Hermon, the sons of heaven sealed their secret. Their hearts were racing with excitement and fear. The oath didn't bind them in chains, but in a choice that would take them from the perfect stillness of their heavenly home to the lively, unpredictable life of humans. And in the stillness, as the wind blew over the sharp stones, it seemed to whisper one truth: the path of desire is both beautiful and dangerous, and those who choose it will never be the same. When the first Nephilim walked among men, the world seemed to hold its breath. Their footsteps were so heavy that they made the ground shake in fields and forests, but there was a strange grace to how they moved, a rhythm that didn't match their huge size. They were huge, monumental bodies that were so well proportioned that even the tallest men felt small next to them. Their eyes shone with a light that seemed to hold both the echo of heaven and the depth of earth's sorrow. It was a light that held memory, longing, and something ancient that couldn't be understood. People who saw them at first could hardly believe what they were seeing. As shadows fell over their flocks, the shepherds stopped in their tracks, their hearts racing. Women at the wells held on to their jars and gasped in awe and fear. People in the village whispered names that had no meaning and called these beings giants. But even that word seemed too small and common to describe how big they were. The Nephilim moved like they didn't belong to any time. Their presence was both amazing and scary. Children, who weren't afraid because they were innocent, would sometimes run close to them because they were drawn to the warmth that came from the giants' glowing bodies. The giants, who were both gentle and far away, watched these little people with the same curiosity that the watchers had when they made them. Their voices were deep and resonant, and they had a weight that could shake the mind as easily as the mountains. When they did speak, it was slow and deliberate, like a river choosing its path. It was soft, but had a strong echo. The first Nephilim were amazing beings, but they were also sad, like morning mist. They had the blood of angels, the breath of stars, and the weakness of people, all at the same time. They were very strong, and with that strength came an understanding of how different they were from others, a feeling of being alone that no one else could fully understand. They could easily lift boulders and bend trees with a touch, but they were held back by feelings that made them weak in ways that physical strength couldn't protect them. Every smile and kind gesture they made seemed to have a sad undertone because they knew they would never fully belong to either world. People's interests grew along with their fear. Farmers would leave gifts at the edges of forests where the Nephilim were known to walk. People sang songs in their honor and told stories by the fire about the giants with glowing eyes who could shape rivers and control the wind. But fear stayed in everyone's heart, quiet and strong. Even people who were drawn to the giant's beauty couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. Power so great, without any understanding or purpose, upset the natural order. Men knew that the presence of these beings would have effects they weren't ready to deal with yet. The Nephilim themselves started to get what was going on. At first, they were driven by a sense of wonder, a natural desire to learn, explore, and live with people. But as they learned more about how strong they were, the world around them felt weaker. Everyday things became dangerous. A swing of the arm could knock down a house, and a step could leave a mark on a meadow. They walked quietly, trying to match the earth's rhythm. but their very nature brought both awe and destruction wherever they went. Some people tried to be like them by lifting tools, or weapons that were too heavy for them, wanting to be great but not realizing that this would awaken ambition that would change over time. The Nephilim became both a symbol of hope and a warning about the dangers of power without wisdom. They were bright examples of what could be, but they also showed how corrupt power can be. Their presence was a quiet warning, a reminder that beauty and strength without a goal could lead to failure instead of success. Stories of their deeds began to spread among both children and adults. One Nephilim lifted a fallen tree to free a family that was trapped. Another guided a river to water fields, and yet another's shadow alone could darken a village in the blink of an eye. The line between fear and wonder got thinner with each story. People watched, both fascinated and scared, knowing that these creatures were as much a part of nature as any storm or fire. But they had never seen anything like them before. The giants themselves knew this and kept it to themselves. Their bright eyes showed both pride and sadness, as if they were always aware of the cost of their own existence. They were the first of their kind, born from a mix of divine desire and human desire. In that mix was the seed of tragedy. There was always an unspoken tension, even in acts of kindness. It was a reminder that their power could never be fully contained, and that admiration from mortals could quickly turn into envy, anger, or fear. Some Nephilim would stand at the tops of mountains in silence. Looking out at the horizon where heaven met earth, they could feel both their origins and their separation. They were bridges between worlds, but they also served as a reminder that some relationships, no matter how beautiful they may seem, have effects that go beyond what we can see right now. Their lives were a song of light and shadow, and every step they took and every look they cast on the people below told a story. So, the first Nephilim traveled the world with a mix of awe and sadness, inspiring stories that would last long after the mountains had turned to dust and the rivers had changed course. People were both fascinated and scared of them, which showed how they were both powerful and weak, divine and mortal, awe-inspiring and cautious. And the giants walked in this balance, which was both fragile and strong. They were silent, bright, and always remembered as the watchers moved among people. The wind carried a hush through the valleys. Their forms were bright but careful, as if even the sun didn't want to see them too boldly. With every step, the air seemed to be full of the promise of revelation, of knowledge too deep for mortal hearts to handle. They gave gifts, the knowledge of the heavens, the secrets of the earth, and skills that would change men's lives. But there was a quiet danger behind every act of teaching. Knowledge that could make a people great could also destroy them. People could feel Azazel's presence in the air as he walked among them. He shaped metal with his hands, making tools and weapons that shone like captured lightning. He taught people how to make the first swords and shields, and every strike and hammering stroke was a lesson in strength and skill. Men were amazed, but also scared. With each weapon, you had to choose between defending and destroying. Every time they swung the iron he taught them to master, they could hear the echo of war, ambition, and pride. It was a gift and a temptation, shining in the sun like a promise of unlimited power. Penemu knelt down next to kids, who had never held a stylus or pressed symbols into clay. She was gentle but firm. He taught them how to write, how to keep their thoughts alive beyond the moment, and how to capture memory and lore in ways that would last. When he touched the letters, they glowed faintly, as if they were filled with light from another world. Knowledge poured into their heads like water, feeding them but never stopping. With each lesson, people started to understand how important it is to express themselves, to write down what they do, to plan histories, and to question what they used to accept without saying anything. But being able to write also made people proud and crafty, because words could change the truth, bring people together, or cause problems. Serial looked up at the night sky and traced patterns that could not be seen with the naked eye. With hands that looked like they were drawing constellations in the air, he mapped the stars. He talked about how the world changes with the seasons and how the heavens move in a certain way. People listened, spellbound, as if each secret about the stars was a tiny key to the universe. But knowing made them feel uneasy. To understand the stars was to picture the edges of the earth and feel how small and fragile their own lives were. Curiosity, which used to be a gentle friend, turned into a desire that could never be fully satisfied. Other watchers gave gifts that were less obvious. They taught men how to make beautiful things, like dyes from roots and minerals, ornaments that caught light like frozen sunbeams, and music that sounded like the soft hum of creation itself. These lessons were a pleasure for the sense-soft and inviting. But even here, temptation was still there. Making something beautiful was a way to get power, make people want something and change their minds. The world got brighter, but it also got more dangerous because any spark of admiration could turn into jealousy or obsession. Each gift was a thread in a tapestry that was both beautiful and dangerous. The watchers, glowing with determination, moved among people with care, teaching slowly and in a rhythm, as if the pace itself could lessen the power they gave. But the earth, wide and hungry, drank these waters up quickly, even though they were amazed by the tools, the stars, the words, and the beauty. Men started to push the limits to see how far they could go before heaven's touch faded. The watchers themselves also felt the weight of what they were teaching. Each lesson was a reflection of their own desire, a shadow of what they had given up to come down to the world below. Azazel felt a pang of fear under pride as he watched the men use the weapons he had made. Penemu saw scribes who wrote down his teachings as records of power instead of understanding. Sariel's eyes followed the stars as she watched men use the patterns to control instead of gain insight. Every gift had two sides, and the calm rhythm of teaching was always followed by the threat of punishment. But even in this careful transmission, the beauty of learning couldn't be stopped. Kids laughed as they drew letters in clay, and farmers hummed songs they had never heard before. Blacksmiths were amazed at how strong they could make metal. The gifts sparkled with the purity of possibility, and for a while, the world seemed to be in a fragile dawn of brilliance. The watchers, in their bright forms, walked among the people with both pride and sadness, knowing that giving light could start a fire. As people learned more, they were tempted more. What started out as teaching turned into wanting. People wanted more of everything, more knowledge, more beauty, more skill, and more power. They started to play around and push the limits of what they had learned, going beyond what was safe. Every new discovery was exciting, but it also brought the world closer to being out of balance. The watchers couldn't stop the tide because the gifts were no longer theirs alone. They had taken root in human hands, and the currents of curiosity and ambition surged forward. The night would come, and in the stillness, some of the Nephilim would think about how heavy what had been said was. They ran their fingers over letters, polished metals, and constellations, feeling both connected and uneasy. Every lesson had opened a door, and beyond it lay the unknown. The the brilliance of progress and the shadow of abuse. People now had knowledge that could either light up or darken worlds. The light of forbidden knowledge made the earth brighter and heavier. The gifts were no longer just lessons. They were challenges that showed how fragile, curious, and eager the people who got them were. Azazel, Penemu, Soriel, and the others stood at the edges of dawn and dusk, their glowing forms still and watchful, knowing that even the most beautiful knowledge could lead to destruction. Heaven and earth were woven together in their gifts, like bright threads in a fabric that was both delicate and strong, bringing hope and danger to everyone who touched it. The first cities began to rise from the rich soil of the valleys, and the horizon glimmered with the faint promise of civilization. There used to be only small villages scattered across the land. Now, stone and clay reached up to the sky, making shapes that looked like they were trying to challenge the heavens themselves. People carved temples carefully, with steps that led up like prayers frozen in stone, reaching for the stars that Serial had taught people how to read. The Watchers taught design, craft, and vision that reached from earth to heaven. Every wall and tower showed the lessons they taught. In these early cities, the streets were lined with clay homes. The walls of these homes were decorated with detailed reliefs showing the good deeds of ancestors and the blessings of gods. The people worked with a new sense of purpose, their hands guided by knowledge that had once been known only to heavenly beings. Under Azazel's watchful eye, tools shaped stone into blocks that fit together perfectly. Penemu taught people how to write and use symbols, which let them write down their laws, prayers, histories, and even their goals. There was no denying that it was a change. People were waking up to something bigger, something that was both beautiful and scary in its potential. The stepped terraces of the ziggurats looked like mountains of thought, and the morning sun made them shine. It seemed like each level told a story. The bottom was about human desire, the middle was about never giving up, and the top was a bridge between human ambition and the heavens above. People looked up in awe and respect, feeling that with each stone they placed, they were touching the threads of the universe. Sariel's teachings about the stars helped priests line up these buildings with the constellations. This made a harmony that mirrored the divine rhythms, turning the cities into living tools for worship and learning. The builders of the cities felt more proud as the cities grew. Men who used to work in the fields now built towers that cast long shadows over the land. Women who used to get water from wells now led chants in courtyards, and their voices bounced off the walls that had been carefully carved. Building itself became a reflection of the human spirit, ambitious, creative, and always wanting to make a mark on the world. There was no hiding pride. It was in every heartbeat, every nail driven, and every brick stacked higher than before. The first markets appeared along the streets, where craftsmen, merchants, and workers were busy. Things moved from one workshop to another, from one person to another. The sun made metalwork shine, pottery shone with dyes made from roots and minerals, and fabrics wove patterns based on the constellations that Serial had drawn in the sky. Knowledge and skill had come together with human desire to create, a pulse of energy that moved the cities forward like a living thing. In some small way, every citizen felt like they were part of something bigger than themselves, caught up in the grandeur of a civilization that was just starting to grow. But even in the midst of all this life, the shadow of ambition remained. The risk of going too far grew when beauty and purpose came together. People built walls, not just to keep people out, but also to show off their wealth. People built towers, not just to get to heaven, but also to show how strong and visionary they were. Both divine guidance and the thrill of having new power made people proud, and that pride started to grow into a force of its own. It was a pride that shone brightly like polished stone in the sun, but it also had the power to break the fragile balance between creation and desire. The temples, in particular, showed how smart and devoted people can be. Each one was like a small city, with scribes, priests, and people who watched over sacred knowledge living there. Carvings of the Nephilim and their heavenly ancestors decorated the walls, telling stories in stone of a time when heaven and earth were one. People quietly performed rituals and made offerings, the air thick with incense and the soft sound of chants. People felt closest to the stars they had learned to chart and the gods who had once walked among them in these sanctuaries, which became centers of culture, learning, and ambition. The first ziggurats cast their shadows over rivers and valleys, and the cities began to have a rhythm of life that was both beautiful and unending. Every day the sun rose and set, bringing work and learning, and every night it set and brought awe and reflection. The world looked smaller, but it was much more complicated. Roads linked one settlement to another, making networks of trade, power, and influence. It was as if the earth had changed shape because of the work of men who were guided, whether they knew it or not, by the bright presence of the watchers who had once walked beside them. The night even seemed different. Lamps flickered in windows, sending golden light across the streets where kids played and old people talked about legends. The stars in the sky, which used to be far away and hard to understand, now looked like the way temples and towers were arranged below. People had learned how to read the stars and shape the earth, and in doing so, they discovered the heady taste of power. Their pride, which was still new but very strong, was a quiet pulse beneath the city walls. It was a reminder that the first stirrings of civilization were as much a victory of spirit as of skill. The first stone cities stood against the sky as monuments to people's dreams, goals, and the quiet guidance of those who had taught them. Every block, every carved relief, and every high terrace held the weight of knowledge, the sparkle of awe, and the undeniable rise of pride. The ground beneath them seemed to hum with potential, as if the earth itself had changed because men were so brave and reached higher and higher, getting closer to the stars. Above and seeing the echo of a light that had first fallen from heaven, the first kings didn't just come from their families. They also came from the fact that the Nephilim were among men. They were tall and bright, and people paid attention to them wherever they went. They were stronger than anyone else, knew a lot, and their looks seemed to glow with a light that mortal eyes could barely stand. People from the village and the city both bowed, not just out of fear but also out of respect, because they felt a spark of the divine in these giants that made them feel both awe and longing. They ruled over their bodies, minds, and spirits. But underneath their royal appearance, they felt a deep sense of loneliness. Being worshipped as gods was a great honor for most people, but for the Nephilim, it was a double-edged sword. Every crown and every award reminded them of the lines they had crossed. They had the blood of angels in them, but they chose to live on earth. The gates of heaven were far away and cold, and people watched them with both awe and fear. They wanted to be accepted by both worlds, but neither could fully give them what they wanted. Men looked up to them and wanted to be like them, while angels told stories about them in secret places. You could feel how alone they were. The Nephilim felt alone, even when armies were gathering to protect their cities, or subjects were kneeling in prayer. They needed someone to bridge the gap between human and divine. The more they showed their mastery by leading with wisdom, building huge structures, and guiding societies with insight. The more they felt the gap between them and their heavenly relatives, it was a desire that no throne could satisfy, a hole that power and the praise of mortals could not fill. Fear of death was also always there. People looked up to them, but they were scared because they knew that such power could lead to destruction. Parents told their kids to be careful around angry giants, and older people talked about how to give tribute without making them angry. Being close to a Nephilim could even be scary, because their power made love seem like an act of bravery. Even though they were scared, people were drawn to them like moths to a flame. The mix of light, knowledge, and overwhelming presence made it hard to tell the difference between man and God. The Nephilim were fair when they enforced the law in the courts of the first cities, which surprised mortals. They were able to do this because they had seen how humans felt. They settled arguments with careful wisdom, gave rulers advice that no human counsel could understand, and stepped in during fights with strength that was both protective and scary. To their followers, they were the embodiment of a higher order, a living bridge between earthly striving and heavenly grandeur. But when they were alone behind closed doors, they struggled with the tension of being both a savior and an anomaly, loved but never fully belonging. Divine jealousy hung over their rule like a dark cloud. From the high places, whispers of unhappiness spread like cold winds, quiet but clear. The angels who had stayed loyal watched with quiet anger, knowing that the Nephilim had chosen a path that could upset the balance of creation. Some people were jealous of how close these hybrids were to humans, even though it was against the rules and dangerous. Some people were afraid of what would happen if people had too much knowledge and power, knowing that every gift and piece of advice could throw the scales of order into chaos. Even though the Nephilim tried to lead with kindness, their divine nature set them apart. The giants felt a pang of emptiness when people praised or cried out to them in devotion. They knew that admiration could never take the place of real friendship. At night, on city walls or hills that looked out over rivers and villages, they would look at the stars, tracing familiar constellations, and feel both the pull of their home and the tie to the earth they had chosen. Their identity was always in between worlds, which made their rule both grand and sad. Some Nephilim found comfort in teaching. They taught human scribes, artisans, and builders lessons in skill, strategy, and understanding. Even in giving, the echo of being alone stayed. They could share what they knew, but understanding true experience. The connection between spirit and existence was still out of reach. Every smile of thanks and every bow of respect reminded them of the limits they could never cross. But the need to connect grew stronger. People loved, feared, and praised them, but the ache of not belonging stayed the same. Myths started to form among the people they ruled. Legends and songs about their deeds, victories, and wisdom spread across the valleys and plains. But these stories, full of respect, couldn't show the private times of sadness and reflection that made up the giants' lives. Every story of miraculous strength or insight had an invisible thread of desire running through it, a subtle feeling of loss woven into the fabric of worship. The Nephilim were full of contradictions. During their rule, they were gods with power, humans with empathy, wise beings from the past, and beings who were stuck between worlds. People may have thought they were perfect, but the giants knew how weak they were. Every act of government, every show of power or guidance, was a careful balance between awe and fear, devotion and loneliness, and admiration and misunderstanding. They were proud of what they had done, but their hearts ached for the distance that no throne, crown, or mortal praise could ever bridge. The Nephilim moved like shadows and light among their subjects, rulers of great power, but also marked by the quiet sadness of being loved but never fully belonging, half divine, half mortal, revered, feared, and always alone. The Sumerians started carving their world into stone on the hot, fertile plains. The marks they left behind would last long after the cities themselves had fallen silent. In the quiet of the workshops, sculptors and scribes worked with their hands. Guided by knowledge passed down through the ages, the last traces of the bright beings who had once walked among men. The stories of the Watchers hadn't gone away. They had changed, becoming myths, preserved in clay tablets, carved reliefs, and songs sung in the evenings when the stars came to life above. Every tablet and sculpture echoed the work of giants who had changed both the earth and the minds of people. Temples rose in tears, with their shapes reflecting the sacred geometry that those who had studied the heavens had taught. The Sumerians called their gods the Anunnaki, a group of gods that were said to be heavenly teachers. Priests called on names that the rest of the world had long since forgotten in their hymns. They asked for blessings that were similar to the gifts of the Watchers, like wisdom, craft, the knowledge of metals in the sky, and the secrets of writing that let thoughts last through time. Kids pressed their hands into soft clay to make these structures, and their eyes were wide with wonder at the monuments that reached up to heaven and down to memory. The which looked like mountains of thought, had a language older than any spoken word inside their stone steps. Every level and every carved relief seemed to whisper the stories of giants who taught people how to work hard and be devoted. Farmers, merchants, and priests all climbed these terraces slowly, feeling the weight of both their physical work and their spiritual goals. They remembered, maybe without knowing where it came from, that beings who had walked the earth had once given them knowledge, and that those beings had been part of humanity's earliest goals. Carvings on the walls showed beings bigger than men with eyes that seemed to glow with light from another world. These beings guided people in building, writing, and studying the stars. Sculptors' hands moved with respect as they carved out shapes that were both real and symbolic, mixing memory with imagination. These carvings weren't just for show. They were vessels of memory, silent songs of the giants whose gifts had built civilizations. Every mark in the clay and every stroke of pigment was a heartbeat from a time when the line between divine and human seemed to be alive and porous. Sumerian. Hymns had similar sounds. Priests and priestesses chanted names and deeds in rhythmic chants while oil lamps flickered. They talked about teachers from the sky who had come down and told them the secrets of metal and stone, the stars and the seasons, harmony and creation. The words flowed like a river, soft but firm, reminding the people that their civilization was built not just on work, but on gifts from beyond the earth. Even though myth turned the figures into gods and spirits, the memory of how they helped stayed strong, like a quiet thread connecting the past to the present. Kids learned how to mold clay into small ziggurats and figurines at home and in workshops. Their elders told stories about the Anunnaki that were both amazing and scary. They taught them to respect the power that came from knowledge and the danger that came with it. Each story had a soft rhythm, almost like a lullaby. But underneath it was the pulse of history. Giants walking among mortals, gifts that could make or break a civilization. The stories had many layers, including practical advice, moral lessons, and subtle warnings, all mixed in with the beauty of myth. The Watchers' names and faces faded from direct memory over the years, but their presence remained in Sumerian life. Farmers arranged their fields based on the stars that Sariel had mapped out. Smiths used Azazel's methods to make tools and weapons, and scribes wrote about their lives using the alphabets that Penemu had inspired. It was a civilization based on memories, both conscious and unconscious, of people who had lived on Earth and taught people to look beyond the present, to strive for understanding, and to feel the weight of wisdom and responsibility in equal measure. It was hard to tell the difference between myth and reality, like a shadow moving along the steps of a ziggurat at dusk. Even people who didn't consciously remember what the Watchers taught were affected by the shapes and ideas that were all around them. The act of shaping stone, aligning towers with the stars, and writing prayers and stories was a repeat of the first instruction, a rhythm that had lasted for generations. Memory, etched into clay and murmured in hymns, evolved into the foundation of civilization, amalgamating reverence, curiosity, and human aspiration into a lasting entity. People gathered in courtyards and temples as the stars moved across the sky. They listened to the evening chants and felt the connection between earth and sky. Every story, hymn, and carved relief had the weight of both teaching and desire. People lived in a world shaped by giants and guided by hands that were no longer there, but whose presence could still be felt in the air, in the stone, and in the rhythm of work and devotion. The Sumerians, whether they knew it or not, passed on the gifts of the Watchers. The lessons of the bright beings lived on in stories and memories, weaving through the heart of a civilization that would last for thousands of years. The ziggurats and temples were silent witnesses to a past that was both real and imagined. They were monuments to the sky builders of Su, guardians of knowledge that had once come down from the sky and into flesh, leaving humanity with the lasting imprint of celestial guidance, wonder, and a quiet, unending desire to touch the divine. The desert went on forever, a sea of sand that shone like gold in the morning sun. It was here, in the dunes and along the banks of the Nile, that the first Egyptian kingdoms began to wake up. Their stones rose from the ground as if gods had shaped them. The pyramids, huge and quiet, shone in the soft morning light. Their huge shapes cast long shadows that stretched across the desert like ancient sentinels. These structures were more than just tombs or signs of power. They were the echo of a once bright presence, the Nephilim and their teachings imprinted on the land, woven into stone and aligned with the heavens. People whispered about the Shining Ones, beings whose steps had first helped lift huge blocks and whose hands had drawn the lines and angles that would line up with the stars. People used to believe that the giants of old, who were now only spoken of in myths, taught the builders how to listen to the rhythm of the Nile, measure the stones with care and respect, and honor the skies above. Every alignment, from Orion's belt to the bright light of Sirius, told a story of cosmic order and knowledge passed down by those who had walked between heaven and earth. The desert was quiet and endless, holding these memories like a sleeping breath, waiting for someone to find them. The builders worked together in peace at twilight, when the moon was low in the sky. The sand moved under calloused feet, the ropes stretched tight with weight, and the chisel hit the stone with a rhythm that was as soft and slow as a lullaby. The wind whispered through the canyons and along the riverbanks, bringing bits of history and memory to people all over the world. The light from the torches made the shapes of men and women look like they were shimmering, as if they had been touched by a faint echo of the heavenly light that had guided their hands. There was a sense of awe in their work because they knew that every stone they lifted and every measurement they made was part of a story that went beyond this world. Legends said that the Shining Ones came down from the sky to walk with these first builders. People said they gave off a light that didn't burn but lit up the area, making soft shadows that danced along the huge stones. Their presence was both soft and strong, setting the pace of construction and shaping the pyramids and the minds of the people. Mortals, who were both awed and inspired, followed their orders with a devotion that came from both admiration and quiet fear. They knew they were taking part in something bigger than themselves, something that would last forever. As night fell, the Nile reflected the stars, showing constellations that Sariel had once mapped. His teachings about the stars lived on even after many generations. Orion, which was perfectly lined up with the pyramids, looked like it was reaching out to Earth, silently reminding us of the order and peace that had been given to us. The bright star, Sirius, shone down on the desert sands, as if to bless the work being done below. The air smelled like dry earth and river water, mixed with the faint smell of incense and offering. This created a sensory landscape that was both real and otherworldly. The stars set the pace of life in the cities. Priests, scribes, and craftsmen all knew about the order of the heavens and the earth. They performed rituals that honored the patterns above. Hieroglyphs wrote down what kings did and the stories that giants told them in secret. Every carving and inscription was a reminder of knowledge that beings who were bigger, stronger, and more closely connected to the mortal world once had. People knew, even if only on a gut level, that their hard work and dedication were part of a larger whole that would last long after they were gone. The desert winds made the pyramids look like they were breathing. Each stone, carefully cut and placed, gave off a quiet energy that was a memory of guidance and purpose. At dawn, workers would stop and listen to the soft hum of the wind blowing through the terraces and courtyards. They could feel the presence of the hands that had once guided them. Every angle measured and every layer stacked showed both human skill and divine inspiration. There was a balance between strength and care, ambition and restraint. The kingdom was surrounded by the vast quiet of the desert at night. Campfires flickered along the banks of the river, and the soft light was reflected in the water. The shadows of the workers stretched long across the stones, and the moonlight that changed made a dance of light and dark. A sense of mystery hung over everything. People quietly accepted that the pyramids were more than just monuments. They were the meeting point of human work and divine guidance, of ambition tempered by reverence, of the real and the unreal. And so, with the stars watching over Egypt and the moon's soft light, it became a kingdom of stone and spirit. The Shining Ones, real or imagined, were present in every monument, every alignment, and every whispered chant. They shaped a civilization that bore the fingerprints of giants and taught people to lift not only stones, but also their imaginations, knowledge and awe toward the heavens above. The Andes Mountains rose like ancient guardians high above the clouds, with their jagged peaks piercing the sky. The wind carried a thin, crystalline chill. Local legends told of giants who lived in the sky and were so big and bright that their hands could shape the earth itself. These giants lived among these tall peaks. They moved with a grace that belied their size, lifting huge stones as easily as a child might lift a pebble. They instinctively knew how to balance and harmonize terraces and walls. People in the valleys below watched in awe as they traced the shapes of mountains and terraces. as if they were reading a language carved in stone by invisible hands. People said that the giants would come down from the sky when they were needed and bring with them knowledge that could change the lives of mortals. Their footsteps left patterns on the hillsides, terraces that were perfectly level, pathways that were carefully carved, and megalithic structures that looked like they were made with great care. People who lived near their work thought the mountains were alive, shaped by their own will instead of nature's whims. Stories passed down through the years said they were not far off gods, but friends who taught, guided, and inspired, leaving lessons in stone that only those who looked closely could understand. The Andean people sang and told stories about these memories. Kids learned about giants who sang with voices that sounded like wind blowing over glaciers and whose laughter echoed through the canyons like rolling thunder. Elders would say that terraces and walls were not just buildings, but gifts and lessons written in stone. Every block fit together without mortar, and every slope was perfectly measured. It felt like intelligence and care were humming quietly in the air. The rivers and streams even seemed to follow the paths of these beings, winding through the valleys in ways that looked like the terraces above. Legends said that the giants would share their knowledge with anyone who really wanted it. They taught how to use ropes and levers to move stones, how to make terraces that would hold water and help crops grow, and how to read the stars so that planting and harvesting were in sync with the rhythms of the stars. Every lesson was soft, patient, and almost like a lullaby, making knowledge a part of the natural flow of life. But they were only there for a short time. They would disappear back into the fog of the mountain peaks, leaving only the marks of their hands and the memory of their help. Across the Andes, stone buildings stood like silent witnesses to this partnership between people and skyborn giants. Terraces went up steep hills, walls curved around river bends, and ceremonial platforms were set up so that they caught the first light of the sun in a precise and respectful way at solstices and equinoxes. The craftsmanship spoke of knowledge beyond human years, as if each stone carried the imprint of the giant's touch, even after hundreds of years. People who traveled and people who built could feel the echoes of otherworldly hands in the angles, the precision, and the quiet perfection of the arrangements. These high places were surrounded by a peaceful silence. Clouds moved between the peaks, the sun and shadow played on the terraces, and the wind whispered through the canyons, bringing bits of song and story with it. Every step I took on the mountain paths felt like a conversation with the past, a quiet connection with the people who had shaped the land in both useful and holy ways. There was no rush or need to explain. Just walking, looking, and feeling the rhythm of stone against hand and foot became a ritual in and of itself. Memory and humanity were linked, and every gesture echoed the patience and care of the teachers who came from the sky. Life in the villages that clung to the mountain slopes was in sync with both the earth and the sky. People learned how to farm the steep terraces, move water through carved channels, and build houses with stones that fit together perfectly. The way buildings and ceremonial platforms were lined up even whispered of advice that had been given long ago, echoing the words of giants who had once walked these lands. There was a vague but strong sense that their civilization was the continuation of something bigger, a meditation in stone and soil left by beings who were both mortal and divine. These Andean stories remind people of other stories about giants shaping the earth. They are echoes of similar dreams and myths from Egypt, Sumer, and faraway places. The giants left behind things that can't be explained in a normal way, whether they were teachers, rulers, or builders. This makes a quiet, meditative link between cultures that are separated by oceans and generations. In each story, there is a sense of respect for both the knowledge shared and the mystery of the people who shared it. This shows that some wisdom is meant to be felt and experienced, not just explained. The mountains themselves seemed to keep the memories in their silent, jagged shapes. The sound of rivers, the rustle of grass, and the echoes of voices long gone could be heard as the wind blew along ridges and through valleys. Standing on the edge of a terrace and looking down at the cultivated valleys below and up at the peaks covered in clouds, one could feel the pulse of the past, the imprint of hands that shaped not just stone but also the very rhythm of life. The giants' lessons were in every block, every curve, and every carefully measured incline. They were a meditation on permanence and patience, a quiet invitation for people to learn, remember, and honor the land that held them. In the Andes, the terraces and walls, the ceremonial platforms and paths were more than just monuments. They were living memories, whispers of sky-born giants who taught, shaped, and guided. They were in the space between stone and air, earth and sky, and in the hearts of the people who walked among them. They quietly reminded people that knowledge, care, and respect can leave marks that last long after the people who first gave them. As the sun went down, the sky turned gold and violet, and the desert looked like a living ocean, with waves of sand rippling beneath it. In this huge, quiet space, stories were passed down from one generation to the next by winds that moved like breath across the dunes. Travelers talked about Iram of the Pillars, a city made of marble and gold that once shone in the middle of Arabia. Its columns reached up to the sky like fingers. They said that at night, when the stars shone with a cold light, the desert seemed to whisper bits of old knowledge, memories of cities that had been on the edge of dreams and reality. People said that the lost cities, which were spread out across Arabia and Africa, held treasures beyond measure, not just gold and jewels. The most valuable thing they had was the knowledge that beings who lived on Earth long before human empires rose had given them. Legends said that the structures were carved with incredible accuracy and that the huge halls and towers were built so that they lined up with the movement of the sun and stars, as if the heavens themselves had told them where to go. Over time, the sands buried many of these wonders, leaving only hints in the form of scattered ruins, the faint outlines of streets, walls, and temples that glimmered under the moonlight. People said that Iram, the city of pillars, was a place where people and bright beings lived together in peace. People who lived there were good at metallurgy, astronomy, and architecture. Some said that the knowledge came from people who had come down from the sky. Every pillar, courtyard, and golden threshold told the story of hands that guided, taught, and shaped, leaving marks that could last longer than human memory. Travelers who got too close to these ruins felt a strange calmness, as if they were being watched by something they couldn't see. It was as if the giants and watchers' teachings were still in the air, folded into the stone's shapes. Similar stories came out of the huge deserts of Africa. Cities grew in beauty near river valleys and oases. Golden domes caught the first light, and detailed carvings told stories of beings that were both mortal and divine. The ruins that were still there were often buried under red and orange sands that glowed at dawn, showing just enough to suggest how great things used to be. When the wind died down and the desert's song got softer, you could almost hear the whispers of voices long gone, giving advice, warning, and guiding, as if the earth itself remembered the knowledge that had been shared in these places. Merchants and nomads, talked about these cities in low voices, describing visions of huge courtyards, statues with glowing eyes, and walls covered in knowledge that could reveal the secrets of the heavens. They talked about maze-like palaces that were perfectly aligned with stars and solstices, which showed knowledge that was way beyond what humans could understand. People could sense that there was something otherworldly about these cities, even if they didn't know where it came from. There was a hint of guidance and intelligence that made them more than just mortal ambition. It seemed like every glowing stone was humming with the faint echo of giants who had once walked among men, sharing forbidden knowledge and shaping civilizations with care. The desert winds carried more than just sand. They carried memories that bent around the ruins, rustled through the empty pillars, and whispered across the walls that had been baked by the sun. People who were traveling and resting next to broken pieces of these golden cities felt a strange calmness, as if the air itself had a secret rhythm. The desert was never quiet. It was full of echoes from the past, of wisdom that was both dangerous and life-changing, and of lessons that were never spoken but were real in the space between the sun, stone, and sky. People who were paying attention could hear the rhythm of ancient hands moving, shaping, and teaching. These hands left a quiet mark on the world that lasted even after it fell apart. The night felt like it was full of memories. Stars burned brighter over the desert than over any city. They cast cold white light on sand and stone, bringing to life the silent shapes of cities that were once full of song and movement. Travelers thought they saw the footprints of giants, their glowing bodies bending over terraces and teaching mortals how to measure, carve, and build with purpose. These being shadows, which were both short-lived and long-lasting, seemed to stretch across the sands and mix with the dunes. They reminded those who dared to walk among them that knowledge had once come down from the heavens and shaped the world's forgotten cities, the lost cities, whether they were in Arabia or Africa, seemed to come to life under the stars. The air was full of memories, and the sands sparkled with faint images of golden walls and pillars that had stood for hundreds of years. The wind shaped the dunes into shapes that looked like streets, temples, and palaces that time has long since erased. It did this by bending and folding them, and in these remains you could feel the giants' teachings, which were carved into the stone and buried under layers of dust, waiting for people who could see and remember in this huge desert, where there is no noise and light moves slowly over sand and ruins. The stories of lost cities become real. They are reminders that every civilization that the giants touched had a piece of divine instruction, a spark of knowledge that could light up the mind and heart of a person. The whispers don't stop, even when the winds erase footprints and the sands cover walls. They are soft and persistent, like a lullaby of memory, carrying the essence of lost golden cities, of Iram and its pillars, and of teachings that continue to ripple through time, waiting for those who are ready to listen and feel the weight of the past in the present. The world that used to shine with wonder for both mortals and celestial watchers started to change. The Nephilim became restless, and the light in its corners began to fade. The giants, who were born out of love and curiosity, used to walk among people with grace and wisdom. Their gifts shaped cities, art, and knowledge. But as time went on, the brilliance that had made them so amazing began to change. Arrogance came from strength without limits, and recklessness came from curiosity without wisdom. Fields that were once cared for now had scars from their strength. Forests that were once cared for now fell into careless hands, and rivers that were once guided into harmony now ran red with chaos. The innocence of early civilization started to fade as power was abused, and a shadow slowly spread across the earth. At first, their excesses were small. Crops were trampled by huge feet, animals were hunted too much, and fights were settled with fists that could crush mountains. The Nephilim's bright eyes, which used to be soft and reflective, started to shine with something harsher: hunger, impatience, and a desire to be in charge. People who had once looked at these beings with awe and hope began to shrink under their gaze. They were afraid not only of the giant's strength, but also of how their plans could change at any moment. People who had hoped for help and safety now felt scared and unsure. The land itself seemed to be sad, and the skies darkened in response. The winds whispered warnings that came too late to stop the tragedy from happening. Heaven looked down with sadness that would last forever. Angels who had once quietly watched as knowledge was shared now saw those gifts become tools of power instead of tools of enlightenment. The divine pain wasn't loud or angry. It was quiet and deep, like a mourning for the innocence of both Nephilim and humans. Every act of destruction, every talent that was used wrong, and every sound of violence in cities and forests sent waves of sadness through the unseen realms. The same beings who had celebrated the union of heaven and earth now cried quietly as their creation fell apart, wishing they could step in without breaking the natural flow of free will that had been allowed. The giant's corruption happened in layers, some of which were small and some of which were huge. Sometimes the Nephilim would go back to being kind and helpful, teaching, guiding, and even healing, as if they were trying to remember how beautiful they used to be. But these times didn't last long. They were soon forgotten in favor of selfish and cruel acts. People who were both in awe and scared of these beings started to talk in hushed tones about how they were both angels who had fallen but were still glowing, and giants who could do terrible things. Families hid their kids, communities strengthened their homes, and the world became a place where the line between wonder and fear was very thin. Every day there was a chance for creation or destruction. The sadness of heaven was reflected in the world around us. Rivers that used to be lifelines were now full of storms that came from uncontrolled hands. Winds that used to softly sing through valleys now howled with rage, bending trees and scattering crops. Animals ran away to the mountains and deserts because they were scared and confused. They could feel that something was wrong. At night, even the stars looked dimmer, as if they were reflecting the sadness that had settled over Earth. A quiet echo of grief from places we can't see, mourning the gifts that had been given and now ruined. People who saw the giants turn violent felt a mix of fear and helpless awe. The Nephilim, who had once been teachers and protectors, became both a myth and a source of fear for humans. Villagers prayed and whispered their names, carving symbols into floors and walls to protect themselves from a power they couldn't fight or fully understand. People dreamed not of wonder but of shadow at night, under the same stars that had once guided construction and harvest. They dreamed of beings whose brilliance now threatened instead of lifted, but there was still a glimmer of beauty in the shadow. Times when the Nephilim remembered where they came from. A child saved from a flood, a city saved from destruction. A lesson shared in humility. These things happened quickly but stayed with me, reminding me that even in the midst of corruption, the light that had once been there still existed. Heaven watched these flashes with quiet sadness, holding on to the hope that the cycle might turn again, that the balance of light and shadow, creation and destruction could be restored. Even for a short time, as violence spread, It wasn't just physical destruction that marked the fall. Knowledge itself became dangerous. For example, metals were turned into weapons instead of tools. Writing was used to control instead of keep, and astronomy was used to gain power instead of learn. Cities got bigger and more beautiful, but their foundations shook with fear and violence. People who had once been amazed by the combination of divine and human effort now realized that beauty without wisdom could turn into fear. Every mistake, every act of excess, and every flash of uncontrolled power made the shadow over earth darker. The world was slowly bending under the weight of its own potential being used incorrectly. The sad look of heaven never changed. There was a quiet sadness in the air, the winds, the rivers, and the stars. It wasn't punishment that came from above. It was deep, patient grief for the suffering of people and the evil of the Nephilim. Every act of cruelty was a note in a silent requiem, a song of loss and longing that echoed in the hearts of both mortals and gods. As the giants walked the earth, switching between being brilliant and cruel, the shadow grew. It wasn't sudden or loud, but it was patient, slowly spreading across the lands. This left both humans and Nephilim to deal with the effects of power, choice, and the thin line that connects creation to the divine. Night had fallen over the world, wrapping the land in a quiet darkness. But even under the vast canopy of stars, there was a sense of unrest. In the quiet, human voices rose in whispered mourning, weaving through the cool air like silver threads of light. Families huddled together in small homes, their hands folded in prayer, their hearts heavy with fear and doubt. The Nephilim, who had once been guides and protectors, had turned into unpredictable giants whose presence could both awe and terrify. This made people wonder if the gifts of old had turned into curses. From the deserts to the valleys, from the villages by the rivers to the hidden mountain hamlets, whispers of sadness filled the night, a soft chorus that went beyond the mortal world. In the midst of all this sadness, a single thread of hope appeared. A man who walked closely with God and whose heart and soul were in tune with both heaven and earth. His name was Enoch, and he was a person who had a calm and quiet authority about him. It seemed like his feet barely touched the ground while his mind soared toward the stars. People said that his eyes showed a level of understanding that was deeper than that of most people. They could see both the beauty of creation and the shadow that was creeping up on it. As prayers rose like smoke toward the sky, Enoch's spirit was moved with compassion, as if he were carrying the weight of human suffering himself. Enoch heard the quiet cries and tears of people who couldn't understand the huge forces that were changing their world. He walked through villages in the soft light of the moon, seeing the fear in children's eyes, the tired acceptance of elders, and the silent desperation of workers who had seen their crops trampled or their homes destroyed by beings much bigger than them. Each scene carved itself into his mind, creating a tapestry of sadness and longing that went along with the quiet rhythm of prayer. The ground under his feet seemed to pulse with the same sadness, and every stone, river, and gust of wind echoed the silent cries of people. Enoch figured out what he was supposed to do during these times of quiet thought. He was not just a witness. He was a messenger chosen to bring God's words to a world that was on the edge of hope and despair. The prayers of weak and trembling mortals had drawn the attention of the gods, and it was his voice that would give both warning and advice. Enoch knew how big the job was, but he didn't feel scared or proud. Instead, he felt a calm understanding come over him, as if the stars were softly lighting his way and quietly approving of what he was doing. Enoch's mind kept going back to the Nephilim, the huge kids from heaven and earth whose light had turned to shadow. He knew how complicated their lives were, how love, curiosity, and the need to connect had brought them into the world, and how too much power had caused problems and pain. People's cries were not just complaints. They were calls for healing, for direction, and for a way to get through a world that had been touched by both divine beauty and dangerous knowledge. Each prayer seemed to make a thin connection between earth and heaven, a path that Enoch would now walk, the smell of far-off rivers and desert sands, flowers and grasses, and the soft sounds of people crying mixed in with the night air. Enoch stopped on top of a small hill to look at the stars. He saw constellations he had memorized and mapped, patterns that spoke of order and cosmic rhythm. He knew that the same beings who had once guided people with wisdom, like giants and watchers, had affected these constellations and left messages in their alignment. The prayers he heard were in tune with this celestial rhythm. They echoed beyond what he could see and made a silent symphony that only a few tuned-in souls, like his, could hear and understand. So Enoch got ready to speak, to go where the human and divine met, and to carry the words of warning and wisdom across lands that were shaking from the weight of misused power. Every step forward was guided by the soft chorus of prayer that rose from villages, tents, and hidden groves. It was a fragile music of hope in the middle of chaos. The night was dark and full of shadows, but the sense of purpose lit his way. It was a soft light that showed the divine trust that had been placed in him. He could feel the world's heartbeat in the quiet spaces between each human cry. It was fragile but strong, waiting for a voice to give it clarity and direction before the shadow spread further. The quiet cries kept going through the night, full of fear and longing, changing the air around Enoch as he walked. And even though the world was asleep under the stars and moonlight, he felt a sense of awakening. He knew that the bridge between despair and deliverance was real, but it was also fragile. His job was to listen, walk, and tell people what heaven wanted. This would be the thread of hope that both people and the watchers could one day rely on. The world fell silent, deeper than any night had ever been, as if the air itself stopped to watch what was about to happen. The archangels began to come down from heaven's silent heights. They moved not with rage but with sadness, their bright forms cutting through clouds like soft silver and gold streaks. The earth seemed to hold its breath below them, with dunes, forests, and rivers all waiting. Their eyes held the weight of countless ages, seeing both the innocence that used to be and the shadow that now stretched across human lands. The wind rose in soft gusts as they moved, bending trees, stirring waters, and speaking in a language older than speech. It carried the grief of the divine across mountains, valleys, and plains. Each archangel had a quiet power that didn't come from fear, but from understanding cosmic balance. They had patiently watched the Nephilim grow, thrive, and fail, all because of curiosity and forbidden love. The gifts that were once meant to help people had become tools of chaos, and the prayers of people had become so loud that they could no longer be ignored. The world had turned into a stage where both wonder and tragedy happened, and it was time for the watchers of heaven to join the story again as they fell. Nature put on a show of power. Lightning arced silently across the horizon, lighting up distant hills in short bursts. Wind stirred into rhythmic swirls, rustling leaves and bending grass in time, and storms gathered softly, as if the air itself were making a stage for what was to come. The light that surrounded the archangels was not harsh or blinding. Instead, it was soft and wove through clouds and shadows, touching the ground like gentle fingers of gold and silver. There was grace in every movement, as justice slowly and carefully unfolded after a long wait. When the archangels got to the edges of human settlements and the Nephilim's hidden strongholds, their voices echoed through the world, calm but commanding, giving orders as if they were spoken by the very pulse of creation. They didn't ask for revenge or punishment in the way that people do. They talked instead about bringing things back to normal and finding a balance, about bringing back those whose power had gone too far, and about getting rid of the darkness that had started to creep into people's hearts. Every word was a vibration that could be felt in bones and soil, rivers and sand. It was a reminder that divine law moved through the world not as oppression, but as a necessary flow of order. The watchers, who were meeting in secret, felt the archangels coming as a tremor in the earth itself. Some were frozen in awe, others shook with fear, and a few, full of defiance, tried to hide from what was going to happen. Heaven's presence wasn't scary like storms or earthquakes can be, but it was heavy enough to make even the strongest stop. It was a heavy feeling of knowing that the gifts they had so eagerly shared and the choices they had made could not be ignored. The Nephilim themselves, in far-off places and secret cities, felt the change. The air seemed to get tighter, and a light seemed to touch everything, signaling the coming of divine help. The winds and storms carried whispers of orders. The archangels began to hold back, moving in perfect harmony. Some of the watchers were gently pulled up, not with force, but with an energy that seemed to wrap around their essence, soft but strong. Others were cut off from the giants they had made, the glowing children who now walked among mortals, torn between the light of their birth and the darkness of their corruption. Every move was planned and thought out, with the knowledge that these beings were not just enemies, but creations of love and curiosity that had gone off course. The natural world reacted as the archangels traveled through mountains and deserts. Lightning flashed across faraway peaks, not to destroy but to light the way for both angels and watchers. Winds carried echoes of the orders, stirring the sands into shapes that looked almost alive, like the dance between heaven and earth. The rivers, which had been scarred by the mistakes of the Nephilim for a long time, seemed to ripple in recognition. Their waters sparkled in the moonlight, as if they were carrying messages between worlds. The decision wasn't harsh, and it wasn't made all at once. It happened slowly, like the dawn over the land, gently but irreversibly. It was a reminder that when creation gets too far from harmony, balance must be restored. People watched from a distance, feeling awe instead of fear, as if they were aware of forces beyond their understanding. It was a quiet reminder that the prayers that came from human hearts were heard and acted upon. The sky itself became a canvas of soft brilliance. Storms mixed with moonlight, clouds bent to light up the arches of divine authority, and the air hummed with the sound of cosmic order. It looked like even the shadows of the Nephilim were reacting, bending, shrinking, or disappearing as the archangels did what they wanted. And in the middle of all this, you could see heaven's sadness in every gust of wind and every tremor of light. It was a sadness that was patient, kind, and planned. This wasn't destruction for its own sake. It was correction. It was a way to bring back the delicate balance between the divine and the human, between knowledge and innocence, between the light and the dark. In a world that was shaking under the weight of both promise and loss, the earth itself seemed to groan under the weight of the Nephilim's fight. These tall beings used to be in awe and curiosity of each other, But now they were torn apart by pride, jealousy, and the restless longing that had always been in their hearts. The oceans, which were big and patient, started to move with more force. Waves crashed against cliffs like the anger of giants who moved across continents. The mountains, which were old and unmovable, shook as beings with the power of heaven and the weight of mortal ambition walked on them. Every valley, every plain, and every hidden grove became a stage for a drama that had started with whispers but was now heard all over the world. The giants' fights weren't sudden or chaotic like people might think. Each fight was planned, slow, and almost ceremonial, as if the earth itself was keeping time with steady heartbeats. Their deep, resonant voices echoed across the land, carrying both warnings and sadness. Even after the sound had stopped, echoes stayed in the canyons, and even the winds seemed to remember each strike, roar, and clash of limbs and wills. In the woods, trees bent and broke under their hands. Rivers were turned or churned into raging torrents, showing the anger that had once been reserved for storms. The Nephilim were beautiful and terrible at the same time. They moved with grace, but left behind destruction. Even though there was a lot of fighting, their conflict had a strange rhythm. It was a war not only of strength, but also of ideas, of long-held desires, and of old rivalries that had quietly grown under the guise of unity. Some giants wanted to be in charge, wanting to be seen as leaders over both mortals and their peers. Others fought to protect what they still remembered as beautiful and meaningful. Every battle had more than just physical effects. It was the echo of 1,000 choices, the result of gifts given and misused, and the sadness of angels watching in silence. The sun and moon even seemed to respond to this beat, casting long, shaking shadows over the fields and hills where giants fought. The oceans, which used to be calm, showed how upset these huge beings were. The waves were higher than the tallest cliffs, and they crashed in a rhythmic way that was like the giants' strikes. Salt water rushed into secret coves and river mouths, changing the shape of coastlines as if the earth itself were trying to hold back the power that was raging on it. Sailors and people who saw the show from far away whispered about mountains moving and waters roaring, and shadows that passed over villages and forests as if the sky were breaking apart. Even in valleys that people didn't dare to enter, the ground shook, reminding everyone that the world's fabric was now intertwined with the rage of its children. The mountains, which had been silent witnesses for thousands of years, shook under the weight of footsteps that felt like storms. Peaks that had once stood for patience now shook, and rocks cracked and slid as blows that sounded like distant thunder hit them. Valleys turned into arenas, forests turned into fortresses and battlefields, and rivers turned into barriers and weapons. All of this happened because of beings who combined heavenly power with human impulsiveness. But in the middle of all the chaos, there were brief moments of recognition. Giants stopping to look at the ruins they had made. The silent grief that passed between those who remembered where they had come from, and the echo of something beautiful and bright that had been lost. Noah stood on a hill, one of the few places that had stayed above the flood's reach, and looked out at the changed world. His eyes followed the patterns of rivers and streams that had just been cut, the soft ripples on lakes that had once been meadows, and the soft glimmer of sunlight dancing on forests that were too wet. Every sight seemed to have both a warning and a sense of wonder, a silent reminder of how fragile life is. The ark, which was now resting quietly on the ground, was a sad reminder of what had been saved and what had been lost. Noah's heart raced with awe and deep humility. He felt the weight of survival, the quiet thankfulness for the protection he and his family had received, and the tremor of unease at the echoes of stories that were still not finished. In this fragile peace, the world spoke in ways that were hard for people to understand. Seeds moved and stirred beneath the rich, rain-soaked soil, which was the last remnant of a time long ago when they were buried under layers of water and time. There were small, almost unnoticeable movements in the ground that suggested life beyond the normal. These were signs of beings whose origins went back before human memory. Plants started to grow, and animals slowly came back. But there was a strange sound in the earth itself, a quiet vibration that seemed to carry the echoes of the giants, their victories, their failures, and their presence that still lingers. The memories of the Nephilim seemed to have settled beneath the soil, where they waited patiently and watched for the day they could rise again and touch the world above. Noah's eyes, which showed both sadness and sunlight, looked out over the horizon, where the water's edge still sparkled. The flood left behind islands of broken stones, broken wood, and the occasional glint of metal in some places. These may have been pieces of knowledge that the watchers once gave. His hands, rough and steady, brushed against the ground as he walked, feeling the faint pulse of life that had survived the flood beneath his feet. The animals, who had just been let out of the ark, were cautious and curious as they walked around. They pawed at the mud, sniffed at the roots that had been disturbed, and glanced at each other with cautious trust. Noah saw the strength of creation in their soft, cautious movements. It was a quiet reminder that life would go on. Even after disaster, the sky itself seemed to show this delicate balance between sadness and hope. There were soft, gentle layers of clouds that hung around. Some were still full of rain, while others were starting to move in slow, deliberate arcs. Sunlight came through in thin beams, lighting up the landscape in dappled patterns that moved over rivers, hills, and the distant shadows of mountains that were still sharp and imposing. The gentle, wandering wind brought with it the smell of wet soil, the smell of freshly washed forests, and a hint of salt from oceans that had taken back distant shores. It was a symphony of quiet renewal, soft but strong, a reminder that life, though fragile, had a rhythm that even the flood could not erase. But there was still a memory that wasn't completely human beneath the surface of this new world. Stones that were pressed together seemed to hum softly, as if they were remembering the weight of huge feet that had walked over them. There were shadows in caves and riverbeds that moved just out of sight. They were the remains of beings that were too big and strong to be forgotten. The earth healed, sprouts pushed through mud, and new streams carved new paths. But the presence of the ancient giants, whispers of their deeds, and imprints of their strength remained, subtle but undeniable. Every creak of a branch, every ripple in the water, and every sigh of the wind told a story that had survived the flood. It was a whisper from a world that was older than what humans could remember. Noah felt the weight of these hidden echoes as he stood in the soft mud and new plants. He was thankful to be alive, but he also felt a slight unease because he knew that the waters had not erased all traces of the past. The air seemed to carry hints of secrets buried under layers of soil and stone. These were secrets that were once given to both mortals and giants, but now they are hidden under the quiet hum of the earth as it heals. It was a reminder that history never really goes away, even when it is hidden. It waits, patiently and watchfully, for the time when its stories will be felt and remembered again as the last of the floodwaters went down, leaving behind a world that sparkled under a sky that looked like it was about to dawn. There was a deep stillness that settled over the land, river, and valley. The creatures that lived moved slowly. The ark stood still as a symbol of strength, and Noah's eyes showed how fragile and strong life can be. But under the mud and stone, under the roots and riverbed, the whispers of ancient giants continued, faint but persistent, a reminder that the past, though hidden, still lingered beneath the soil, waiting for the day it might once more rise to meet the light. Even though the waters went down and the world slowly got better, signs of the giants didn't completely go away. The bloodlines of the Nephilim lived on in the valleys that weren't completely submerged, in hidden forests and deserts, and under the hills. They were quiet, almost invisible, but they were full of memories of great strength and forbidden knowledge. People called them Rephaim, or Anak. Legends said that Og of Bashan was a king from a line so old and big that the earth itself seemed to know where he walked. These remnants moved quietly among people, their presence soft but undeniable, like shadows cast by stars that no longer shone as brightly. The survivors of these bloodlines weren't always huge, but there was something special about them that showed in their eyes. The subtle width of their shoulders, and the rare flash of unexpected strength. Mothers warned their children to be careful, passing down the faint memory of powers and wonders that no mortal should have had. Fathers, who were careful and watchful, talked in low voices about giants who had come before, the watcher's actions, and the dangers of knowing too much. It was a family line that was kept secret, woven into the very fabric of humanity, and lived on in quiet places where the flood's cleansing touch could not reach. In some valleys, old stones still had carvings on them that showed kings and warriors whose feet had once pounded the ground with authority. The carvings were too big for people to see. Travelers would come across these ruins and maybe remember them as monuments to a lost civilization. But they wouldn't know about the hidden lineage that still existed, children of giants, subtle but undeniable. The earth seemed to hum softly when they were there, a vibration that was almost too small to notice. It was a reminder that strength and knowledge had not been completely lost. The wind carried whispers, as soft as the sound of leaves rustling, of those who had walked before and whose blood still flowed quietly through descendants, who were hidden in the shadows. The biblical passages that mentioned these beings stayed in memory and text, even though they were only half remembered. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men. Genesis whispered through time, its words soft but powerful, like a lullaby of warning and wonder. Every time someone talked about Rephaim, Anakim, or Og of Bashan, it brought back memories of a time that most people had forgotten. These names, passed down through the years, were silent warnings and reminders of a history full of divine rebellion and power that had once risen and fallen. There were stories among the people, stories told in quiet times by the fire or under the moon. Elders talked about men and women who seemed normal but had an amazing ability to bounce back from anything, even the worst winters or moving boulders. Some people were born with an instinct for ancient crafts that were both subtle and exact, as if their hands remembered movements that had been lost to human memory for a long time. Some people seemed to have dreams that showed them visions, like flashes of skies full of wings and voices that whispered secrets meant for the brave or the forbidden. People often thought these stories were just legends, but they were based on some truth. The blood of the Nephilim had found a way to live on, quietly becoming part of the fabric of humanity. These secret bloodlines even reached rulers and kings in far-off lands. When armies marched and cities grew with stone walls and towers of ambition, some people made decisions that were based on something older. Maybe they moved with unspoken confidence, or maybe their plans were so smart that they were beyond what most people could understand. Or maybe the fear they caused in others was like the awe that people once had for giants. The descendants of Nephilim, who were quiet and patient, changed the course of human history. Their presence was like a quiet undercurrent in the river of everyday life. But the legacy had two sides. These bloodlines were haunted by strength without understanding and knowledge without wisdom. Some carried the scars of violence that their ancestors had caused, the echoes of battles that had taken place across mountains and oceans. Some brought gifts of wisdom, intuition, and skill, reminders of the greatness that had once touched humanity before pride and power turned it into corruption. The world was getting better after the flood, and these hidden threads were there, unseen but strong, as if nature had gently folded them into the ground and let them grow quietly over time in the forests, the valleys of Bashan, and the highlands that people rarely visited. The children of these lines walked quietly, not knowing how big their inheritance was. Their eyes, which reflected the sky and the faint light of faraway stars, sometimes showed how strong they really were. And below the surface, in the quiet soil and stone, and in the rivers that had survived the flood, the Nephilim bloodline continued to pulse. It was dormant but alive, a whisper beneath the ordinary, a subtle reminder that even in survival, the ancient world had not completely faded. It seemed like every part of the world held pieces of memory, the sway of trees like giant arms, the tremor of hills like footsteps that echoed, and the deep, silent hum of stones that had once been very heavy. The story of the lost bloodlines lived on in these pieces. People didn't always see or understand them, but their presence changed the world's rhythm, quietly guiding, influencing, and reminding people that some stories, no matter how deeply buried, never completely go away. The heat, dust, and constant noise of people working made the air over the plain of Shinar shimmer. Hands that were rough and eager lifted stone and mortar in a way that showed both hope and ambition. From a distance, the project looked like one big pulse of energy across the earth, a huge tower reaching up to the sky, with each layer showing how creative and united people are. But underneath all this hard work and excitement was something older, a memory whispered into blood and bone, a faint echo of the Watcher's own quest for the heavens. It was as if the descendants of those giants, who were hiding in the shadows of survival, were quietly guiding the hands of mortals toward a dream that was part human pride and part legacy that would last forever. Noah's kids, who knew the stories that had been passed down quietly through the years, watched with a mix of interest and fear. They moved among the builders, bringing food, measuring stones, and offering to work when they could. All the while, they felt the pull of ambition that had once led to a flood. There was beauty in their work and in the shared vision of something great coming out of the dust. The sunlight shone on the stone towers, which cast a shadow over fields and villages. But there was a quiet warning in the air, a tension that hinted at limits and lessons that had not yet been learned. The workers sang songs about their work, chants that rose like smoke into the soft, hazy sky. They didn't know that God was warning them. Every stone that was placed and every wall that was built was a claim against death itself. It was a human attempt to understand the infinite and touch what had been reserved for the heavens. The sound of hammers hitting chisels and the soft rumble of carts, moving stone across the plain, mixed with the heartbeat of pride. They thought they were invincible because they were all together, not knowing that even the children of giants couldn't fully control human pride. The Repine bloodline was still there at the edges of the plain, but it was so subtle that it was hard to see. Their eyes, which reflected the sun and the faint shimmer of clouds, watched the people with quiet caution. These hidden descendants felt the faint pull of ambition that had once led their ancestors to ruin. The same drive that had brought watchers from heaven to earth, but they stayed apart, only speaking to the wind and not giving advice directly, being careful not to get too involved. Still, the shadow of ancient knowledge hung lightly over every stone laid and every corner raised, as if the earth itself remembered what it had been through. The tower got taller every day, and its top reached for a sky that looked both inviting and impossibly far away. Scaffolds went up next to the walls, and men and women climbed carefully, their movements precise, each step a mix of hope and fear. There was a quiet pause across the plain at dusk, when the sun was low and the light painted the building in shades of molten gold and soft violet. Shadows grew long, and a soft but persistent breeze blew through the dusty air. It was a moment of fragile reflection, when the vastness of human effort met the inevitability of the unseen. It was an almost sacred silence that reminded those who felt it that ambition, no matter how noble, has a weight that can't be seen. People talked softly about coming together and reaching for the divine. Men fought over measurements. Women taught kids how to mix clay carefully, and yet, even though everyone worked together, there were small rivalries and unspoken tension in the workplace. The same curiosity and desire that had once driven the Watchers to come down to the world of mortals now stirred in human hearts a desire to know more, to rise above limits, and to leave a mark that would last through time. It wasn't a careless impulse. It was a gentle, human one, beautiful in its desire, but also cautious, like something from the past that even the wind seemed to remember. As night fell, the plain became quieter. Fires flickered at the edges of camps, and shadows of walls that weren't finished yet spread across the ground like gentle waves. Stars appeared, pale but steady, watching people from far away. From the heavens, the memory of rebellion lingered, an invisible reminder of separation, of the limits placed upon mortals and giants alike. The soft murmur of the night carried whispers that only the oldest trees, the deepest stones, and the wind itself seemed to hear. Every breath of air and every small movement of nighttime animals added to the lull of a world that was trying to find a balance between ambition and humility. And yet, even though the people worked hard and the tower got higher and higher, the land seemed to have a subtle vibration of restraint. Some stones moved a little bit because they were set too quickly, and some beams shook in the wind when they were lifted. It was as if the earth, filled with the memories of giants and watchers, softly whispered against the boldness of men. Underneath the proud surface of effort, there was a quiet conversation with the past. It was a reminder that even though people could reach for the sky, the echo of divine separation and ancient consequences lingered, waiting for the times when pride might go too far, even though it was morning and the workers were getting back to work. The plain was strangely quiet under the noise of the construction. The air felt heavier with expectation. The sun felt warmer but farther away, and the tower, which was beautiful and strong, stood as both a warning and a sign. It reached for the heavens not just to defy them, but also to aspire to them, bringing to mind those who had once come down from divine realms and whose ambitions had changed the world and whose legacies still live on in the hidden bloodlines below. Each stone placed was a heartbeat, and each layer was a whisper. They carried on the brilliance and quiet caution of history, reminding the world that pride is beautiful but always has consequences. The night sky has always been a place for stories, with its stars drawing the shapes of beings much bigger than men, beings whose shadows live on in myth and memory. Before Olympus rose, the Greeks talked about titans, huge beings whose strength shaped mountains and rivers and whose fights echoed across the sky. Their struggles were not just stories of war or power. They were lessons that have been passed down through the ages about pride, creation, and the fragile balance between the mortal and the divine. The stars in the sky, which were only faintly visible, formed the shapes of these giants, who were frozen in the sky as a quiet reminder that the past, though far away, still affects the present. Norse legends say that the giants who lived in the cold, misty fjords of the north lived in places that humans couldn't see. Their frostbitten hands and huge bodies shaped the icy landscapes of Midgard. Their stories, told by firelight on long northern nights, mixed fear with awe and showed that great strength could be both protective and harmful. People were scared of their power, but they also respected them, maybe because they knew, on some level, that these giants were part of the same thread that ran through all of creation, a line of beings who connected worlds and whose existence hinted at mysteries beyond what people could see. In the colorful lands of India, which are farther east, the Devas and Asuras are in stories about cosmic wars and divine courts. The lines between giants and gods are not clear here. Their huge bodies hold knowledge, power, and conflict. People said that mountains were their shoulders, rivers were their flowing breath, and the ground they walked on was a canvas of memory. These figures, like their Greek and Norse counterparts, were larger than life in both body and mind. They represented ideas and truths that people could only understand in bits and pieces. The stories that were passed down through the generations were not just made up. They were based on an ancient world where the line between the living and the dead was not as clear. The stories from these faraway cultures are very similar. They are about huge beings that are no longer seen by humans and whose lives were connected to both the mortal and the divine. Every myth has its own cultural clothing, but they all have something in common. It's like the earth remembers and tells the same truths in different languages. The stories of titans, and Devas still hold faint memories of the Nephilim, the Watchers, and the bloodlines that survived the flood. There is a quiet symmetry, a cosmic pattern that connects continents and civilizations through the shared dream of beings who touched the heavens. The constellations themselves connect these far-off stories. Orion, the great hunter, stands watch over the night sky, reminding us of our desire to chase and conquer, and of the giants who once walked in forms as big as these patterns in starlight. The stars Taurus, Leo, and the Pleiades whisper hints of great battles, huge shapes, and places that the normal eye can't see. The stars, which are always there and never get tired, hold the memory of myths that have been told for a long time. They twinkle softly, inviting people to trace the shapes and remember the stories that are in their minds. The Pacific Islanders told stories about giant ancestors who used their hands to shape islands and whispered secrets about the stars and the seas. Even though each story uses different words and pictures, they all show the same awe at power, the same tension between the divine and the mortal, and the same memory of beings that are bigger than life. It seems that every culture, separated by mountains, oceans, and deserts, came to the same conclusions on its own, based on a shared belief that there were once giants among men. The stories of the thunderbird and the giant spirits of mountains and rivers in the Americas have similar themes. These beings could call up storms, make valleys, and give or take away knowledge. The Hopi, Aztec, and other native tribes talked about giants who changed the land and the moral memory of their people. Every story has a soft warning and a sense of wonder that makes the listener realize that strength, wisdom, and self-control must be balanced. This is a lesson that people have learned before from the Nephilim and the Watchers. The wind blows through forests, across deserts, and over oceans, carrying bits of these stories and subtle vibrations that the human mind can pick up on even when it's quiet. The stories of titans, Yartuns, Devas, and other huge beings are not just stories. They are memories that connect the sky above with the ground below. In every culture, the whisper lives on in its own language. It is a soft hum that reminds people that the giants of old were not just stories about stone and muscle, but also about knowledge, rebellion, and connections to other worlds. These stories make you feel like there is an unbroken thread of memory that connects civilizations across time and space, all under the same starry sky. The echoes of Nephilim and Watchers, who had great power and secret knowledge, flow through myths like soft currents, linking one dream to another. And even though the giants are no longer seen, their shadows are still there, fragile but strong, woven into human imagination, telling us that the past is never really gone but lives on in every myth, every constellation, and every quiet moment under the night sky. There is a quiet world below the rolling hills and jagged mountains, where the sunlight falls softly and amber. This world is not affected by the busy lives of people. The earth here hums with a soft, almost imperceptible rhythm, as if it remembers things from long ago. People in the village whispered about the sleeping giants under the stones. They were so big that the hills seemed to bend around them, holding their huge bodies. These weren't scary figures. They were people who had been waiting for a long time. Their breath mixed with the roots of trees and the sound of streams flowing underground. Every mountain and every forgotten ruin seemed to have a heartbeat. Slow and steady, a rhythm that reminded people that some things will always be there, even when they are still. Legends said that the Nephilim had walked the earth before the flood, and their deeds could be heard across valleys and plains. When the waters came, many people died, but the stories say that a few found safety beneath the solid earth, hiding in caves and stone-hewn rooms. They lay there, huge but calm, their great strength locked away, their eyes closed in quiet meditation as the years went by. Some said that the mountains had grown around these people while they slept, protecting them and keeping their bodies in shape. People said that only the softest wind, brushing across the ridges at dusk, could make the earth sigh. This was a whisper of the giants' dreams mixed with the soft rustle of leaves. People who walked near the highest peaks often felt a strange heaviness in the air, as if they were being watched by unseen eyes. There was a mix of calm and awe, as if the land had been there for a long time and was still alive. Streams that flowed from hidden springs seemed to whisper softly, telling stories of giant beings whose footsteps had once shaped mountains and valleys. In some caves, stalactites and stalagmites made shapes that looked like arms and faces, as if the earth itself remembered and honored the shapes of people who had walked above. It felt like every echo and shadow had a tiny mind of its own, reminding people who passed by that beneath the surface lay the resting power of giants whose stories had become legends. These sleeping beings were often connected to old ruins that were spread out over plains and hidden valleys. People said that stone circles, walls that were half buried in dirt, and old temples were the places where giants rested or the remains of their civilization. People in the village told stories about buildings that had grown so big that no normal hands could have carved the intricate patterns on them. Even though the flood washed away most of the surface, these remains stayed behind, silently reminding us of the size and mystery of the beings below. People who dared to stay among these stones felt the spirits that were still connected to the earth. There was a calmness that made it seem like time itself was bending gently around these resting forms. The mountains let out a sigh in the stillness of twilight, and soft breezes swept across the ridges and valleys. Some people said that the earth's sigh carried bits of dreams, like pictures of old cities, huge hands shaping stone, and stars in the night sky. These dreams were not nightmares. They were echoes of a time when the line between mortal and divine was not clear. The giants were still connected to the living, even though they were sleeping. Their presence changed the balance of land and sky, stream and wind in a small way. People who traveled there would talk about an eerie calm, as if the mountains were breathing slowly and holding the sleeping power of beings whose reach had once reached the heavens and the earth. Even the plants and animals seemed to know. These sleeping beings were there. The trees grew in strange ways, with roots that wrapped around hidden caves and leaves that rustled in ways that sounded like old songs. Rivers and streams made soft music through the valleys, whispering against the rocks as if they were carrying knowledge too old for words. Sometimes the ground shook a little, not because it was dangerous, but because the giant's pulse echoed beneath the surface, faint but steady. Even the most skeptical observer couldn't deny that there was something huge, patient and alive beneath the mountains at these times. It was a legacy of the Nephilim that was resting quietly, not waiting for anyone, but shaping the world in ways that no one could see. According to legends, if a mortal got too close or too boldly, the mountains would respond with a soft resistance, a gentle reminder of the line between what can be seen and what can't. Paths would become like mazes. Shadows would grow longer than they should, and even the moonlight would seem to stop at the edges of the stone. But for those who came with respect and silence, there was a sense of connection, a brief connection with the ancient beings resting below, a brush with history that was more like whispers and sighs than words. The line between myth and reality became less clear in this place, and the giant's rest became a living memory, gently woven into the earth's rhythm. These stories have been told for generations, passed down gently from parent to child and from elder to wanderer. Each story had not only the picture of huge beings lying in wait, but also a picture of how people are amazed, humbled, and amazed by things that are too big to understand. Mountains, hills, and ruins were more than just places on a map. They were living reminders of how ambition and patience, power and stillness can work together. The giants were sleeping, but they were everywhere, in the hills' curves, the sound of streams, the stillness of the wind, and the quiet thoughts of people who dared to look beneath the surface of the earth. There is still a faint pulse beneath the soil. Even now that the sun is shining on the peaks and the shadows are stretching across the valleys, people may walk by without noticing. Kids may play on gentle slopes, and the world above may be full of life. But down below, in hidden rooms and huge caves, the giants lie still, their breaths mixing with stone and roots, and their dreams floating through the earth like old whispers. It is a soft, patient, and eternal presence that reminds us that the memory of huge beings lives on beneath the mountains and beneath the surface of human understanding. Cradled by the earth and echoing through the silence of time, there were whispers of knowledge that time had tried to bury, deep beneath the ground, where shadows pooled and silence reigned. These weren't just regular secrets. They were pieces of an old memory written down on fragile scrolls and carved into tablets that had survived floods, fires, and the slow decay of hundreds of years. People who traveled and studied talked in hushed tones about the lost writings of Enoch, the man who had walked with God and whose visions were too big for regular people to understand. People said that his carefully and respectfully written words held maps of the stars, instructions on how to understand how the stars move, and the wisdom of those who had seen the heavens and come back to tell the story. Each piece had a heavy weight, as if the information it held could make people feel both awe and fear at the same time. These tablets were often found with protective symbols or inscriptions that were meant to keep them safe from unworthy hands. They were hidden in secret chambers under hills, inside hollowed stones, or even in the walls of forgotten temples. The air around these hidden treasures seemed to hum softly, as if it were vibrating with the minds that first wrote down the wisdom. People said that Enoch's writings talked about more than just the stars. They also talked about how angels moved, the hidden order of the world, and the forbidden knowledge of metals, medicines, and the arts that the Watchers had once shared with people. There were many layers to each line of text. It was a language of subtlety that only people who were looking for the truth with respect could understand. Legends said that people who found pieces of these tablets often felt a bittersweet sadness. The finder wasn't scared. They were in awe, realizing that these words had survived many disasters to be heard again. The tablets were fragile and made of materials that didn't break down easily, but they showed signs of having been hidden for hundreds of years. The ink, which was made from crushed minerals and secret resins, stayed shiny even in low light, as if the knowledge itself wanted to last longer than flesh and time. The halls where they rested were filled with a quiet reverence, and the voices of long-dead scribes, angels whose whispers had guided hands, and a man named Enoch, who had seen the mysteries of heaven and returned to guide the mortal eye. Maps carved into stone showed constellations perfectly aligned, the paths of celestial bodies carefully drawn, and the locations of mountains and rivers on earth mirrored in the stars. Later, scholars who saw bits of these maps noticed strange connections to the heavens, patterns that couldn't have come from normal observation. Enoch's lost writings appeared to link earth and sky in a way that was both poetic and exact, reminding readers that knowledge was not just a tool, but a bridge between worlds, a rhythm that echoed through both mortal and divine dimensions. But the tablets weren't just about the sky. There were parts that talked about what people could do, the gifts and dangers that the Watchers gave them. Some inscriptions suggested that some metals could heal or hurt, some arts could shape or destroy, and that knowing how to use knowledge responsibly had a moral weight. There was a gentle warning in the lines, reminding us that having too much knowledge can be just as dangerous as not knowing anything at all. The sad beauty of these warnings hung in the air, as if the scribes had put the memory of the sadness that comes from seeing gifts misused into the words themselves. Finding a tablet was almost like a ritual in and of itself. Scholars talked about the small signs that led seekers, a faint shimmer on the edge of a stone, the way shadows lined up softly at dawn, and the way wind moved through an empty ruin as if it were pointing to a hidden room. In those moments, time seemed to stretch, and the world went quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath while the seeker reached for knowledge that had been sleeping for thousands of years. And when the tablet was shown, even a little bit, it seemed to hum with the presence of both the scribe and the watcher. It was a quiet connection that linked the past with the present in a fragile but deep way. The hidden wisdom wasn't just technical or mathematical. It was also poetic, with layers of metaphor and allegory. Astronomy and celestial lore were mixed with stories of fallen angels, giants, and the long-lost stories of the world before the flood. Every symbol and diagram seemed to whisper, asking the person looking at them to stop, think, and feel the weight of knowledge as both a gift and a duty. Reading these tablets was like walking a tightrope. You had to keep your curiosity in check and your wonder in check. These teachings found their way into myths and rituals in many cultures. Some scholars thought that the Watchers had passed down knowledge about metals, astronomy, and writing. This knowledge could still be seen in the architecture of early temples, the designs of stone circles, and the chants of ritual hymns. Even though the original tablets were lost or hidden, their echo can still be heard in every human effort to connect the earth with the sky, the body with the spirit, and mortal understanding with divine insight. It seemed like the memory of Enoch's writings and the advice they gave floated just below the surface of human culture, a soft undercurrent connecting different places and times in a quiet, shared reverence. Even now, the thought of the lost tablets makes me feel a quiet longing in my heart. The idea that pieces of the past might still be hidden under mountains, deserts, or old ruins makes me feel sad. It makes me think of a world where knowledge sleeps, waiting for the right time to speak to those who are ready to listen. In the stillness of the night, when stars shine like distant beacons and the wind whispers through forgotten valleys, you can almost feel the faint hum of their presence, the breath of a wisdom that has lasted for centuries, waiting for the careful, patient seeker who comes not with greed, but with quiet awe. People in the ancient world thought of kings and rulers in a certain way because of rumors of their extraordinary ancestry. In the golden lands of Egypt, the pharaohs were not just regular people. They were thought to have the blood of heavenly beings in them, a hidden lineage that connected them to the great watchers and the Nephilim who had once walked the earth. Their very presence gave off an otherworldly aura, a quiet sense that they were different and chosen in ways that people couldn't understand. The pyramids that reached the sky, the complicated hieroglyphs, and the rituals that were done in the hot desert sun all seemed to show that this divine connection was real. People who saw them thought the pharaohs were both protectors and messengers. Their power came not only from their human ancestors, but also from the stars themselves. In the fertile valleys of Sumer, which were far to the east, kings sat on thrones made of carved stone. Their jewelry and clothes sparkled like sunlight on water. The claim of divine descent was also strong here, spoken in the gentle words of hymns and myths. People said that the Anunnaki, who were very tall and wise, walked with early rulers and gave them knowledge and power that could make them legendary figures. Genealogies not only showed family trees, but also celestial favor. They showed the lineages that had the subtle power of the fallen angels, the watchers who had mixed their essence with humans. People respected and kept these unions secret. They were remembered in stories of kings who were unusually wise, could do things that normal people couldn't, and were always weighed down by the weight of their extraordinary heritage. This concealed lineage was not merely emblematic. It influenced politics, religion, and culture, giving human societies structures that seemed almost like they were meant to be. Laws and decrees were often seen as signs of God's will, as if the rulers were the ones who received wisdom from the stars. People in Egypt thought that pharaohs were gods on earth, a real example of heavenly power. Every action, every ritual, and every order echoed with the faint hum of something bigger, an unseen connection to the watchers who had once shared their knowledge. The people were both amazed and scared. They knew that this was not just human power, but something that carried the echo of a union between heaven and earth, a bloodline that gave them power and a heavy burden of responsibility that legends told, of rulers who had the gifts and the burdens of their Nephilim ancestry. Their eyes could make you feel awe or fear, showing how divine and mortal are both strong and weak. Some were so wise that they could read the stars and guide their people with a clarity that seemed like a miracle. Others felt like their heritage was too much for them to handle. They were very strong and wise, but their tempers could get out of control. This duality was a common theme in many cultures. The more divine the blood, the more responsibility and risk there was. Ancient scribes wrote about this tension in cryptic verses, mixing warnings with praise for rulers who could use their inherited power fairly. The Sumerian kings in Mesopotamia said they were descendants of the Anunnaki, and their power came from both conquest and family ties. Their names often had references to the heavens, like stars and angels. There were temples in the sky where the stars lined up with these holy claims, making a tapestry of land and cosmos that were connected. People did rituals, ceremonies, and offerings to honor this divine connection. This made the throne seem more than just a place of power. It was a bridge between worlds. People thought that the blood of the Watchers and the Nephilim flowed through these rulers' veins, giving them the knowledge and power that had once built the first cities and civilizations. In Egypt, too, pharaohs traced their ancestry to mythic unions, combining lines of mortals and immortals in both literal and symbolic ways. People said that the Nile itself showed how much these heavenly ancestors liked them. The flood not only helped the soil grow, but also helped kings prove their divine right to rule. Obelisks and pyramids were like signs, silent witnesses to a bloodline that mixed human ambition with the hidden power of heavenly beings. Priests and scribes took great care of these histories, writing subtle hints into stories, texts, and rituals, to remind both the ruler and the people of the sacred ancestry that gave them power. There was a quiet link between royal families and the Nephilim all over the world, from the ziggurats of Sumer to the pyramids of Egypt. These descendants had two identities. They were both human and divine. They lived with a mix of respect and loneliness. Their people looked up to them, but they always knew that their heavenly heritage was both a blessing and a curse. This fragile balance was present during their reigns, which were sometimes short and sometimes long. It was a constant negotiation between the echoes of heavenly power and the limits of mortality. Even in the shadows of history, the faint touch of that long-forgotten union lingered, hinting that the Nephilim and the Watcher's power lived on not just in stories, but also in the bloodlines that made up civilizations. It was a quiet whisper of the extraordinary hidden in the ordinary. The blood of kings was a silent witness to a time when heaven and earth were closer than anyone alive could imagine. It was in the grandeur of their palaces, the solemnity of their temples, and the quiet halls of their tombs. It quietly moved through veins, stories, and stone, leaving a mark on human history that will never go away. Even when kingdoms fell and dynasties turned to dust, the memory of that divine ancestry lived on in stories and legends, as well as in the unspoken belief that some power, some connection to the extraordinary, can never be completely erased from the human world. As Shemyaza and Azazel were taken away, the mountains themselves seemed to mourn. Their once mighty forms were weakened by the weight of God's judgment. The cliffs and valleys were quiet, and the stillness was so heavy and all-encompassing that it felt like it would last forever. The ground below them was cold and hard, and stones dug into their hands and feet as chains of heavenly design bit into their flesh. These chains were not like any other. They were made with the care and precision of heaven, so that they would last longer than anyone could imagine. Each link held the memory of the rebellion, a whisper of broken promises and broken laws. Shemyaza and Azazel could feel the weight of everything they had taught and shared with others in the depths of their confinement. It was a quiet reminder of the lines they had crossed. Echoes filled the caves where they were trapped, bouncing off walls that seemed to get closer and closer with each passing second. When they tried to talk, their voices came back to them in a distorted and faraway way, like a ghostly echo of their own choices. The silence wasn't just the lack of sound. It was the presence of memory, regret, and desire. Every shadow seemed to reach out to them like a cold hand, to remind them of the people they had affected, the Nephilim they had helped shape, and the chaos that had come from the gifts of forbidden knowledge. They had tried to raise people up and bring them closer to God, but now the echoes of their plans sounded sad instead of triumphant. Shemyaza felt the endless pull of longing in his loneliness. He missed the world he had left behind, the mortal, women he had once loved, and the recognition that had once given his life meaning. He remembered something strange and beautiful, a soft light that flickered in the dark, like stars seen from a distance through a narrow crevice. He could see the lives of the giants he had helped make, the cities and temples growing with the knowledge he had given them, but the happiness was bittersweet. Every time people did something good, it reminded him of his exile and was a quiet reminder of the price of crossing lines that were never meant to be crossed. Azazel, who was tied up nearby, felt the punishment in a different way. His bravery, which used to inspire others, now felt like a distant echo of a life that was no longer his. He could remember teaching mortals about metals, weapons, and the arts of war. This knowledge had changed the world, but it had also caused violence and pain. The chains that held him showed how heavy the lives he changed and the corruption that came from his lessons were. The quiet around him wasn't just a lack of sound. It was a living thing that was watching, waiting, and not giving up. The air felt heavy with memories, and every breath reminded me of the uprising that had started under Mount Hermon. In their prison time seemed to go on forever. Day and night, sunlight and moonlight passed by in the faint memories that stayed in their minds. The shadows grew and shrank like they were breathing, making a rhythm that was both painful and soothing. When things were quiet, they could hear the faint sound of winds blowing through the caverns from far away. This reminded them that the world above them kept turning and that life and civilization went on while they were in their quiet exile. The soft sound of these winds brought them a strange comfort, a faint memory of a world they had once loved, even though they had changed it forever. They didn't say much because their loneliness was so great that it swallowed their words. When voices did rise, they were whispers of regret and reflection, questions that would never be answered, and wants that would never be met. Shemyaza often thought about the stars he had once charted and wondered if the heavens still knew him and if the angels who had condemned him felt any sadness for what had been lost. Azazel thought about the weapons and arts he had given to people, which they had turned into weapons of war, and he felt the weight of his duty press against his chest like a stone. Both of them were silent as they struggled with the paradox. Of their existence, they were immortal in essence, but trapped, powerful but powerless, and always aware of the world they could no longer touch. The caves went on and on into the dark, and their sighs made every breath and movement louder and louder until the watchers themselves became echoes inside the echoing stones. The chains didn't shine with light. They shone with memory, recording every wrong move, every choice, and every act of defiance that had brought them here. In these rooms, even time seemed to stop, as if it were bowing to the seriousness of God's judgment. Each heartbeat was like a drum marking the passing of time, and each sigh was a soft cry for the days of freedom and connection with the mortal world that had been lost. Sometimes, when the cave was very quiet, you could hear a bird's cry, the rustling of leaves, or the glimmer of a river far away. These brief feelings were both comforting and cruel, reminding them that the world went on without them, telling the stories they had started but could only watch from a distance. The punishment wasn't just physical, it was also emotional. It was a slow realization that power and knowledge, when used or directed wrongly, could bring sadness even to those who meant to shed light in the dark. Their spirits were still strong, but they were also humbled. They learned the hard way what it really meant to do things out of love and curiosity, and what it cost to cross the line between divine and mortal. Every echo, every moment of silence, and every faint memory of human laughter or heavenly song became part of their eternal lesson. And so they stayed, chained together in rooms that were more than stone and more than metal, stuck between the memory of what had been and the endless expanse of timeless consequence. Their longing was as endless as the silence that surrounded them. The earth seemed to keep a quiet memory, as if the stones and soils had absorbed whispers of a world shaped by both mortal and divine beings. Even as centuries went by and civilizations rose and fell, there were monuments and ruins across deserts, mountains, and valleys that looked like faint echoes of a long-lost symphony. Their shapes silently resonated with the wisdom of the past. The huge, precise pyramids of Egypt were built in such a way that they lined up with the stars, as if they were remembering the celestial hands that had guided their construction. Ziggurats in Mesopotamia, their stepped terraces reaching skyward, seemed to echo the ambitions of ancient kings who once claimed bloodlines touched by the Nephilim. And even in the Andes' hidden places, stones carved with great care showed techniques that were beyond what most people could understand. They whispered hints of knowledge passed down from watchers who had long since passed away. When archaeologists work at these sites, they often feel more than just curiosity. There is a quiet sense of awe in their discoveries, a soft thrill at realizing that each stone and carving holds more than just human history. There is a feeling that the past is speaking, even though it is in a language older than words. As they find walls that have stood the test of time or rooms that have been carefully hidden under layers of dirt, every pattern, every alignment, and every unexpected accuracy points to something bigger, something that combines the Earth's physical memory with the lasting effects of visitors from space. Those who study these structures often say, almost in awe, that they can feel the careful intention of minds that are not entirely mortal and hands guided by wisdom that was once openly present on Earth. People who dream also come here. They don't always use maps or scientific tools. Instead, they trust their gut, visions, or stories that have been passed down through the years. They can feel the pulse of old lands, the hum beneath the stones that sounds like a faint heartbeat, and they can see connections that most people can't. In the stillness of twilight, standing in front of a monolith or an eroded temple, they picture the Watchers and the Nephilim moving through the world, shaping people with hands that are both gentle and firm. The lines between myth and reality get fuzzy, and in this blending there is a sense of awakening, a quiet understanding that the earth still holds memories of the divine encounters that once changed its course. Even stories that have been passed down through the years fit with the facts. Carvings, inscriptions, and city plans show stories of giants, teachers from the sky, and heavenly beings who lived among people. People from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Americas all tell similar stories about huge figures, forbidden knowledge, and huge buildings. This suggests that the memory of these events spread across time and space and became part of people's imaginations. It seems like the earth itself is a storage place for more than just bones and artifacts. It also stores consciousness, taking in the thoughts and energies of the beings who once lived there. Every temple, stone, circle, and hidden chamber is like a page in this silent book, reminding us of a time when heaven and earth were closer together. These subtle patterns are also starting to show up in modern tools. Satellites find connections between old sites and the stars. Laser scans of mountain temples show exact geometries, and chemical tests of stones suggest methods that have been lost to time. But even with technology, there is a softness that can't be measured, the almost unnoticeable hum of order and purpose. The monuments don't talk like manuals do. They talk through vibrations and alignments, in proportions that feel both planned and natural. People who study them often say they have a strange clarity, as if they are touching a thought or memory that is much older than any written record, even older than the first scribes who tried to write down the world's wonders in clay and papyrus. People who travel through these lands often talk about times when everything is quiet, as if the air itself remembers. In the desert heat, among the stone terraces of lost cities, or next to huge tombs, the quiet seems to be full of the sounds of lives that changed the earth. A change in light, a whisper in the wind, or a vibration in the soles of the feet are all signs that are easy to miss, but clear to those who are paying attention. The earth remembers everything, including the giants and watchers, the knowledge that was given and misused, and the delicate balance between human ambition and divine guidance. This memory lives on in both well-known and hidden places, like tombs and temples, hillsides that hide old carvings, and rivers that flow quietly past the remains of human work. Even modern-day explorers, like archaeologists digging in the sand or hikers following old trails through jungles and mountains, can feel this connection. There is a quiet connection to the past, a subtle understanding that the way the earth is shaped, the way stones are placed, and the way temples are built show an intelligence that goes beyond what people can design. The Watcher's influence can still be seen in the temples of the Nile, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, and the megalithic structures of the Andes. It is written into the very shape of the world. They ask people who look closely to stop, listen, and feel the connection between human ambition and meeting God. Even the tiniest things, like a piece of pottery, a worn-down statue, or a piece of carved stone, hold memories. These pieces of art speak softly, almost imperceptibly, of hands guided by a mix of curiosity, knowledge, and respect. They remind people that the earth was shaped by beings who walked with both power and restraint, who wanted to teach but also changed the course of humanity through gifts that were both beautiful and dangerous. The memory of such interventions is not lost. It is preserved in the very architecture of the world, waiting for those with patience and reverence to perceive it, to connect with a story that transcends time, and to feel, even for a moment, the lingering presence of watchers and giants beneath the stones and the soil, even in our modern world. Under the noise of cities and the light of screens, there are times when the mind and heart wake up to something older, bigger, and humbling. When you stand in front of old ruins or under the shadow of mountains carved by hands long gone, you can feel something stirring, soft, almost imperceptible shiver that is neither fear nor excitement, but a gentle recognition that we are part of a story much bigger than our own. These remains of the Nephilim, the Watchers, and the civilizations they affected have a resonance that speaks to more than just the mind. It speaks to a deeper sense of wonder. Every carved stone, every huge terrace, and every alignment with the stars is like a whisper from the past that tells people who stop to listen to think about how knowledge has always come with responsibility. It is easy to picture the giants who used to walk the earth in this new light. Their bright eyes showed curiosity and awe, and their strength was tempered by the restraint they sometimes failed to follow. These figures, which are both divine and human, connect the past and the present by reminding us that the search for knowledge has always been linked to choice and consequence. We can see signs of their presence in the first stone cities, ziggurats that point to the sky, and pyramids that follow heavenly paths. Even now, when archaeologists measure the exact angles of old temples or map the alignments of stone circles, there is a quiet understanding that these buildings were more than just buildings. They were carefully made to honor both the living and the dead, and were places of learning, observation, and awe. Waking up to wonder isn't just about being impressed by what came before. It's also about thinking about how humble you are. In its quest for knowledge, humanity has frequently succumbed to hubris, neglecting the fragile equilibrium between exploration and moderation. The stories of the Watchers, the gifts they brought, and the trouble that sometimes followed, show us that we should be careful and respectful when trying to understand something, no matter how deep it is. To learn is to wake up, but using knowledge without wisdom is like making the same mistakes that people before you made. This reflection is soft, like a gentle breeze over a sleeping city, but it carries the weight of ages. It quietly urges us to recognize the power and responsibility that come with seeing more, knowing more, and changing the world around us. When travelers and dreamers stand at the edge of ancient ruins or trace the shapes of mountains that have been shaped by history, they often feel something that is hard to put into words. It feels like you're looking beyond the veil of everyday life and feeling the pulse of something eternal moving beneath the stones and soil. There is no fear that rises. Instead, there is a calm awareness that the earth itself remembers events, choices, and people whose actions changed the course of human history. In these moments, the awe that fills the heart is a quiet acknowledgement of humility. It is a soft understanding that we are still students in a vast, unfolding story. Even though we may touch on ancient wisdom, myths and legends from all over the world tell the same truths. The Titans of Greece, the Jotuns of Norse tales, and the Devas of Hindu memory all show that people have always known about beings and forces that are stronger than us and that have shaped the course of life. Long before history was written, these stories are not just stories. They are ways for people to remember things together, ways for people to keep their respect for power, their respect for the unknown, and their understanding that awe is a part of knowledge. They make you think, make you want to know more, and most importantly, make you humble. This is a lesson that has been taught over and over again in every carved stone and every temple aligned with the stars. New tools are often used to rediscover these mysteries in the modern world. For example, laser scans can show hidden geometries, and satellites can show alignments that were once hidden from the human eye. But even though technology can show us the details of building, how to measure angles, and how accurate ancient planning was, there is a softness that tools can't show us. It is the emotional resonance, the quiet stirring of the soul that happens when someone stands under a structure that was built with purpose and guided by knowledge that is not entirely human. They can see, even for a moment, the beauty and care that went into making it. So, the awakening of wonder is both scientific and spiritual. It is a mix of careful observation and deep awe. You can feel the presence of the watchers and giants in quiet times, like when the sun sets over ruined cities or the moon casts a silver glow on ancient stone. They are not physically there, but their energy lingers a gentle whisper across time, a reminder that curiosity and creativity were once gifts from above and must be met with responsibility. Knowledge, like light, reveals things, but it also hides things. True understanding starts when you see those hidden things. Every line of script on a clay tablet, every carved relief, and every alignment of the stars becomes a meditation on the delicate balance between what we can know and how we choose to act on it. To awaken wonder is to make the self aware of the deep mystery of being. It is to feel a connection that bridges millennia, to recognize that human ambition and divine interaction have long danced together in the shaping of the world. It is to recognize that the past is full of amazing accomplishments and warnings, but the present gives us the chance to learn with grace, patience, and respect. When we take the time to think, our hearts soften, our minds quiet, and we feel a gentle sense of reverence. We realize that we are part of an ongoing story that started with giants, watchers, and Nephilim and continues quietly with every step we take on this ancient, memory-laden earth. When the sun sets and the wind carries soft whispers of history, one can feel the awakening of wonder settle softly over the heart. It reminds us that even in the age of machines and modernity, there is still a place where curiosity, humility, and awe can live together. The earth remembers, the stories last, and the lessons stay with us, reminding us that we should learn from them, not try to conquer them. We should be aware of our place in a vast unfolding tapestry that spans time, space, and memory. This is when the real awakening happens. A soft, the lasting sense of wonder that makes us respect and revere the mysteries that have shaped the world and still whisper beneath our feet. The world was now in a deep, quiet silence after seeing the rise and fall of giants. Mountains that had been shaken by huge footsteps seemed to let out a sigh and return to the slow rhythms of the earth. Valleys that had echoed with the sounds of huge beings fighting now only held the wind's whisper, which carried with it faint memories of those who had once walked or stumbled through time with strength and wonder beyond what anyone could imagine. Rivers that had been full of tears, blood, and floodwaters were now flowing peacefully, reflecting the soft light of stars that looked like faraway lanterns in the still sky. In this peaceful universe, the earth itself seemed to breathe slowly, as if it were letting go of the weight of thousands of years and returning to a more peaceful rhythm that remains of human civilization, which had been damaged and changed by the Nephilim and their great power, were now quiet and humble. Cities of stone, once proud and full of dreams, were partially taken back by nature. Ivy climbed up old walls, sand blew across broken courtyards, and wild animals ran free through empty towers and temples. The huge structures that used to stand for both wonder and pride now blended softly into the landscape, speaking not of conquest, but of endurance and quiet memory. There was a quiet grace in their decay, a reminder that time doesn't completely destroy things, but changes them into a different, softer kind of existence. The heavens looked down from high above without judging. Stars filled the night sky like silver notes on a huge, endless staff. Their light was not affected by the chaos below. The stars that had guided civilizations now shone steadily, calm witnesses to the ambition and restraint of those who had come before. The stars whispered a calm truth. Every action and choice, whether good or bad, would eventually find its place in the great balance of creation. There was no rush or stress, just the slow, never-ending beat of the universe. The planets moved with quiet majesty, following their paths in harmony. They were not affected by the short-lived histories of humans, but they did subtly echo the patterns that the Watchers first saw, and passed down through generations in the forests and deserts. The echoes of the giant's presence stayed faintly, like the sound of a deep bell ringing long after it had been struck. Where huge footprints used to be, trees had grown tall, and wildflowers had grown in the cracks of walls that used to be huge. The earth seemed to remember, but it didn't hold a grudge. It just made room for what had happened and let the healing process happen slowly. Animals could move around without fear, and the skies, which had once been darkened by huge wings and heavenly ambition, were now clear and open. There was a peaceful balance now, a return to cycles that had been broken by those strange beings who had once lived between heaven and earth. Even the bits of knowledge that were left behind in buried scrolls and forgotten tablets were now safe, waiting for future seekers who would come with respect instead of greed. These silent writings, carved into stone and clay, held a faint light of understanding. They didn't give orders or scare people, but they did help people remember. People who might find them someday would be asked to think about them, not to take over, and to learn how to balance curiosity with humility. It was as if the earth and the universe beyond it were quietly teaching everyone who might come that greatness is not measured by power or reach, but by harmony and the ability to leave the world at peace when one leaves. The people who lived after the giants and the people who would live after them were spared the full memory of how big the giants were. But in their dreams, just before they fell asleep, they could still hear the faint echoes of huge footsteps, see bright eyes, and feel the sweep of wings over the world. These glimpses weren't nightmares. They were soft reminders, amazing images of what used to be that served as gentle warnings and quiet inspiration. People would get up, rebuild, and keep going, taking with them what they had learned through whispers and dreams, stones and stars, and memories that were neither heavy nor lost. Time itself seemed to flow more gently now, with the urgency of conflict giving way to the calm of existence. The victories and losses of the past settled into a calm flow. The wind, which used to roar through valleys like the breath of sleeping giants, now moved with a calm grace, following the shapes of the earth and rocks without making any noise. There was a feeling of completion in the stillness that surrounded everything, not in a sharp ending, but in the gentle folding of history into the endless night. The universe, which was big and patient, held all the stories of giants, watchers, and people with quiet dignity. The stars kept dancing slowly under this calm sky, not caring about the rise and fall of human and divine ambition. Instead, they offered their eternal light as a soft, guiding presence. The earth took a break after healing in its own small ways. The waters were still, the winds were calm, and the mountains and forests only echoed with the faintest memories. The Nephilim, the Watchers, and the civilizations they built had all returned to a quiet sound that could be felt but not heard, seen but not understood. There was no judgment or fear in this peaceful end, only the lasting peace of divine justice and mercy. Eternity, which was big and patient, held the world in its quiet grace, which had always been there beyond ambition and foolishness. And in that silence, with the stars watching over it, the earth breathed softly, holding the stories of its giants, watchers, and children, an eternal lullaby of history that drifted softly into the night, where wonder, memory, and peace stayed together, timeless and calm.